Here with my favorite brainiac, not just smart for a chick, super, super smart chick. I love Courtenay Turner, and she is here to give us Tavistock 101. Hi, Courtenay. How are you?
Hi. Well, thank you for that. I love talking to you as well. I'm doing well. How are you?
Fine, thank you. And I actually meant to pull out from this. I put all my books on the shelf since first time since I moved, and I realized like I should have a 12-step program, and because I just never stopped buying books, and
Me
I,
too.
you too. And my friend Anthony Raimondo, who's a guest also, I think he thinks that there's like a libertarian fetish about collecting books, but I have so many, like John Coleman. I have so many books that are relevant to what's going on with
Ooh.
Tavistock, and I think of Tavistock as like the the element of they that's the social engineering psych arm of they, like the World Health Organization, Bill and Melinda Gates. That's the pharma medical arm. This is the psych social engineering arm, but it has a long history. It's almost 100 years old, I think. I want you to just tell us what you think are the big picture. I've got a few little questions for you, but I think we're just I'll
Right.
just give me a date. Give me the fire hose. Give me the Courtenay Turner fire hose.
Fire hose. Okay. Well, I will say, yeah, I think there might be like a libertarian thing. This is just a total little side note, but I was talking, I interviewed Patrick Byrne recently, and I actually just recorded his audiobook for that article that he had written for the Capital Times magazine based on his life story. And I was like, it's great, but it's 90 pages, so I don't know how many people will actually read it. But have you thought about like a movie, an audiobook? And so I pitched both to him, but we actually did the audiobook already. We're in the process of editing it. And when all this, just to say, yeah, super exciting. So that should be out within the next month or so. But then I was talking to him about, because we were talking about Bill Barr. So you're probably familiar with Donald Barr, right? Donald Barr was his father, who was the
Yes.
headmaster at Dalton High
Oh,
School.
I know all about. I did some research on Bill Barr back in the day, like Katie Barr the door. Like we don't want. There was so much about him that was fishy and all of that. Not to be confused with, I think, Bob Barr, who was a libertarian
Right.
candidate
Yeah,
in
right, not to be
Atlanta.
confused. Right,
But yeah,
but
Bill
because
Barr is
Patrick
sketchy.
is kind of a libertarian too, and so I was telling him that, of course, Donald, like, hired college dropout
Yeah,
Jeffrey Epstein
yeah.
to teach math and physics, right? But right after Epstein left, Donald Barr writes this book, which Patrick actually bought for me because it's super expensive because books are
Space
crazy expensive.
relations.
Yes,
Wow.
I
Is it
know.
fiction? Is it sci-fi?
It is fiction. It's like sex trafficking with aliens, but the
Oh my
characters seem oddly like Ghislaine Maxwell and some familiar characters. They seem to have some similarities too. But yeah, it's like alien sex trafficking.
Okay.
Was
I
telling him about this
wonder.
book, and I was like, "But it's really expensive," and he was, really generous, and he's like, "Oh, you should have it so you can give us the dirt." So
Yes, they are expensive, and the more you talk about them, the more expensive they get, and those things are weird. There's a couple of fiction books that have some from these super deep state guys or insider guys that there have to be a reason for it because they're not wasting their time. There's one about Oklahoma City, which was written by the brother of the sitting governor when OKC happened, and it
I've
was
heard of
all
this.
of,
Yes.
yes, and it was about pinning it on Islamic terrorism, but in the end, I think they decided to pin it on domestic terrorism, like there was another one like that. I think S-Hook or whatever. I can't remember. There was another one they were going to do. They flip it around at the last minute. They have a couple of options. But other than that, it was like eerily similar to what really happened. So I think I'll have to read.
Programming, which is right up the alley of Tavistock,
Yes.
actually. So,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah. Okay. Yeah. Start. Yeah. Fire away.
good segue. All right. So, I figured we would start with, because as you were saying, it's kind of the psychological arm. Although they do go into psychiatry, which is kind of the medical, and there are a lot of overlaps with things like the World Health Federation and, some of the NGOs that are involved in some of the medical, became like Tavistock actually became the Tavistock medical psychology. So there is overlap there, but it is a psychological arm. So I thought we would start with Wilhelm Wundt, who was kind of known as the father of psychology. Not
How
to
do
be
you spell that?
William, it's spelled like Wilhelm,
Yep.
German, so Wilhem, and then WND.
W
Yes,
W U N
UNDT.
D. Okay, yeah, I should
Yes,
know that. I didn't know that
Wundt.
one.
Yes,
I know that, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and a lot of the biggies were associated with Tavistock in the earlier days, but I didn't know about I should have known this guy.
so Wilhelm Wundt, who was known as the grandfather of the field of psychology, the founder of American psychology is known to be William James, but there's a connection there because Wilhelm Wundt is also the father of the PhD program. So he himself had no real formal education. That's why I say the PhD is like the pinnacle of indoctrination because he
Just
was
getting a PhD, because I always think that's funny too. It's like a doctor of philosophy. I have a law degree. That's a doctor of juris, whatever. Like, am I a doctor? Like, it's just so it's pretty funny. And I knew plenty of PhDs who were like, yeah, I'm not a doctor.
yeah,
Yeah.
right. Oh, that was funny. I've had Dr. James Lindsay on. And I introduced him as Dr. James Lindsay, and he's like, "Well, we don't need the doctor part because
Yeah, good.
he's
Good
like
for
that's
him.
kind of an embarrassment now." Like,
Good for him. Excellent. It's kind of like Edward Bernays' white coat when he was on, like, I think it was on David Letterman or something, and they're like, yeah, just because I wear a white coat, you believe what I say more.
yeah,
It's like,
exactly. Yeah, the illusion of authority. And so he
yes.
created the PhD program. He now just a little factoid about him that's interesting. His grandfather was Kirchenrat, and then Kirchenrat Karl Casimir Wundt, and he was a member of the Illuminati. He went by Raphael. That was his code name in the Illuminati. Yeah.
Nice.
So this does not necessarily mean that William was, subscribing to the principles of the Illuminati. However, it is worth noting that he so just so that people, because I know people are going to want to know, like, how do you know that it was actually written in the Illuminati provincial report from Utica. And that was September 1782. So in there it says that his code name is Raphael. And I thought Utica, I just always think it's so interesting. My mom, who was a psychologist, and she always says research is me search. So I always find it's so interesting, all these little connections. I went to Hamilton College, and that was is right outside Utica, New York.
Yeah,
And
Utica. I'm from upstate New York, and I always wonder, like, why were these places thriving hundreds of years ago or 100 years ago or whatever? I assume there was some kind of trade, the water, lumber.
I
I don't know, but you
think,
have to have
well, there's a
something
lot
up
of
there.
steel and
Oh, is it steel?
industrial in Utica. Yeah. I think the train industry, maybe.
Well,
Um,
but the trains are there for carrying stuff. What's the stuff? But yeah, steel is
yeah,
stuff, and
and steel, I
I
think
just feel like
was
back then, like we weren't a service place. Why are people there? But yes, so I'll try to write down everything that you're talking about and put them
okay,
in the
so
show
that we can get,
notes.
and I have notes. I can take screenshots of that
Okay.
too. But yeah, so Utica, and then we'll get to this later, but I just think it's worth noting also another connection to Utica. Well, Hamilton's close to Utica. I mean, it was actually in Clinton, New York. But Edward Bernays, the double nephew of Sigmund Freud, and also one of the primary psychologists for Tavistock, who wrote the book Propaganda, right? His nephew is
Oh,
Mark
I know who
Maron.
he is.
You know who he is,
He
okay?
founded Netflix.
Yes, but he also went to Hamilton College.
Oh, wow,
That's what
really?
I'm
So it's
saying,
a
like,
little
the
hotbed.
connection.
And I think the mayor of Ithaca is, like, hardcore Soros dude, like, it's yeah,
Oh,
there's stuff going
interesting.
on up there. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
weird.
there must be, like,
Interesting.
some sort of a lodge up there.
Well, Cornell
I'd
is
have to look
somewhere
into that.
around there, right?
Yeah, Cornell is, like, 45 minutes
Yeah,
away.
yeah,
Yeah. So, okay, so
interesting.
his grandfather was Raphael in the Illuminati. And then, where was what was I gonna say about, 'cause there's a connection to, yes, okay. So his students, so he had you might have heard of like the Leipzig connection. I don't know how you say it, Leipzig connection,
Leipzig,
right? Leipzig, yeah.
Leipzig, Leipzig.
Leipzig University, right? So William Bunt has all of these students. He has no formal training, but he gives out all these PhDs, and so of course his primary, right. He starts the PhD program, even though he had no formal education, and he was known for like medicalizing and I don't know what the word be, but like scientizing psychology. So this is why he's thought of as the grandfather, because he kind of made it into what they deem to be more of a science. I would argue,
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
yeah, I would argue that it's not actually a science.
Yeah, well,
Um,
it may be morphing into a science. I think it is historically a social science, but they are doing a
yeah,
lot of research on like using psychotropic drugs. And I mean, I'm not advocating for it or
yeah,
not, but I think they're like doing actual studies now of like, oh, this turns this switch on and that's what that makes you do. So I think
yeah.
it may be getting more scientific, but I would say sociology and psychology are just,
Yeah,
tools
the
of
foundings
manipulation.
really warned, and I even would argue, even with those experiments, it's like it's kind of, they work backwards, they reverse engineer. So
Mm.
they're doing a lot of manipulation, right? Bernays' whole premise was making opinion making. That's actually what they call polling, and that comes out of
Oh,
Tavistock as well.
that's hilarious.
They
And
called it
and
opinion making. They didn't call
also
it like surveying the mass
right,
opinions.
right. It's like, building consensus. It's
Yep.
not about getting people to compromise on their positions. It's about
Right.
getting people to get on board with what you want. But I would say, like, about the science thing, defining what is science would help. And I would think, I think a fundamental tenet of science is to
Mhm.
do experiments to predict outcomes and do experiments based on your hypothesis, which is totally unethical in any deep way for for humans. So it really even if they wanted it to be a science, they couldn't actually do it in an ethical way. I'm going to
Well,
turn my back at you for a second to find a book
okay.
that's relevant, but keep talking.
Okay, well, it depends also, I mean, I would say science is that you test the hypothesis, right? But there should be controlled studies, and so you have to look at the methodology of what they're doing, and a lot of times they're not all that, unbiased. So,
Okay, I have
yeah.
to show you this book.
Okay.
His It's called Rhythm, Riots and Revolution.
Ooh.
It definitely has some, like, racist stuff in there, which I did not like.
Oh,
It's from the '60s, but it talks about the real psychological experiments that they could do in the Soviet Union because they didn't have the kind of strictures that we have, so they kinda, like, off-site it and then bring
mhm.
it back in. He wrote another book called Communism, Hypnotism, and the Beatles. So, I'm guessing this David Noble or David Nobel this book is impossible to find. You can't even
Ooh,
Google it, like,
is he in part of the Nobel family, as in Nobel
no, it's
Prize?
spelled
Oh,
different.
okay.
It's Noebel. He seems like kind of a Bible Belt kinda guy, but this is from
Oh.
the book was $1. So, it was definitely from the '60s, but I would just yeah, he's an evangelist, yeah.
Oh,
And
okay.
it smacks of that. However, it's got a lot of information in there, and it seems like a lot of Tavistock stuff. So,
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Communism and the Beatles, I'll have to track that one down. Okay, keep talking.
Okay, so his psych lab students included people like Pavlov, right? This is where we get a lot of the like the Pavlovian experiments. The Skinner box is kind of a derivative of that,
You
right?
know, Skinner's daughter, who helped develop the Skinner box with him as a child, committed suicide.
Really? I don't think I did know that.
Yeah, I
Recently?
believe so.
No.
No, but I mean, as an adult,
As
like,
an
I'm just
adult.
not sure the Skinner box was the best way to raise a kid, but, it's not necessarily a person's parent who's at fault for something like that, but,
Yeah,
just
probably
saying.
not. So William James, of course, who is known as the father of American psychology, and Stanley G. Hall. Now, Stanley G. Hall is interesting because he was the mentor to John Dewey, who was also largely instrumental in bringing the modern day education system to the United States, which was predicated largely on the three-tier Prussian model. Um, you're familiar with that, the three-tier Prussian model? Which
I'm
is
not, because I was distracted. This
okay,
is
so I'll
terrible. This
just
is bad podcasting. I just wanna say
oh,
that she says that's not true, that she was not raised in a Skinner box, and I'm not that it's a widely spread myth, so I gotta correct the record on that. Okay, give
oh,
me the
okay.
Prussian model. Go, 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 go.
Um, yeah, I'll have to look into that though, but I'm
Yes.
sure he used some sort of, Skinner
No offense,
technique.
Courtney, but children of psychiatrists and psychologists can definitely have, aren't necessarily better raise.
Well,
You know what I mean?
yeah, I mean, if research is me search, then typically they're trying to figure out some sort of solutions to their um potential pathologies or pathological tendencies.
Right.
But I think now, having done the studying I've done about the origins and the genesis of psychology and the field itself, the indoctrination alone, I think really, I used to think that people went into psychology because they were trying, it's a study of the soul, essentially, right? But what I think has happened is really these people were really engaged in mystical practices. They, is essentially like they wanted to do magic. And yeah, when you look at, I mean, Freud, Jung was a mystic. Freud was
Yes.
interested in things like alchemy, like mentalism. They
Yep.
wanted to be able to read people's minds and control their minds. And they were looking at all sorts of, whether it be through drugs or through um, you know, therapeutic practices, ways that they be able to have this kind of mind control, mind power.
Well,
So it really is in kind of form magic,
yeah.
witchcraft.
I want to plug that into my overall opinion of psychology and sociology for a long time now has been that they were developed to disconnect you from
Spiritual.
trusting, but no, the opposite,
Oh,
from trusting the evidence of your senses. So so you can say, "Oh, this guy did that because he's jealous or he's covetous, he stole my thing," whatever. They'll say,
oh,
"No, like there are deeper meanings for this," or you'll say like welfare doesn't work because people will just not work to get welfare. It's like, no, people want to work, they need self-esteem, they won't really exploit the process like that. It's like, yeah, but in my experience of what happens in human relations and human interactions and my own motivations, it seems pretty straightforward. And I feel like psychology and sociology are there to justify irrational or illogical policies and directions. And and they have to have you disconnect trusting your own senses.
so I would agree with that, but that comes later. It comes out, they call
Right.
Tavistock called it segmentation. And this is part of how they create groups. So that you identify with the groups. We saw this with like the Frankfurt School. Of course, they, codified it into much more of a systematized philosophy. But a lot of the original experiments come out of Tavistock, and they call it segmentation. So I think there's a lot of truth in that. And this is where like the group dynamics come into play, and they were studying how people become irrational in groups. They were testing it. Of course, this is it's always under the guise of research and testing, but we see later it did become weaponized. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that. But in the origins of it, what I really think it was is they were creating these I used to say secular, but I would actually just call it esoteric, occultic solutions to spiritual problems. So they're pulling
Oh,
people away from what is
interesting.
right, because if you look in prior time, before the fields of social science, people would go to their spiritual religious leaders to solve a lot of these problems
Definitely.
of the soul, right? And with the advent of psychology, now they're going to a therapist, and they would
Right.
do
That's my
right.
mother hates that, and I was just telling somebody on air, I think Snyder, that, my uncle, who was a priest, gave me a book, Plato, Not Prozac, and it was
Yes,
about, it was philosophical, and I think it's right, actually.
I think so too. So Dewey was so the three-tier Prussian model is just really, briefly, because that's a whole rabbit hole, but it was after the Battle of Jena in 1807. They lost during the Napoleonic Wars. They lost the battle, and they realized they lost it because the soldiers rebelled. And why did they rebel? Because they were critical thinkers. So they decided they wanted to create an education system to breed mindless obedient soldiers. That's literally the translation of what they had decided. And so they created this three-tier system, which is very much what our public school, the United States public school system, is predicated upon.
That just blew my mind because I might have mentioned this to you before, but not in this context, and finally makes sense to me. Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations says,
Mm,
"Oh, liberty, liberty, no
mhm.
government, blah 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 blah, but we need public schools otherwise we'll have, uneducated soldiers. And I'm thinking, why would you want educated soldiers? Like, that's the opposite of what you would want. And of course, that's exactly what the education is, just a euphemism for something else.
Yeah.
Indoctrination, dumbing down. Wow, that really squares the circle, as they
And
say.
it's predicated on militaristic principles, right? This is why we have a bell that sounds so you're programmed. It's very jarring, right? This is trauma-based mind control. The bell rings, you freeze. Okay, run off to the next class, right? It's all of these. That's just one example, but there's all like they dictate when you can go to the bathroom. I never
Yeah, and
understood this
and
as a
learning
little
is
kid.
so unfun with them. Like, it's so
Oh yeah,
unfun, and learning is so fun.
so fun.
So
I mean,
fun.
this
I mean,
is
look, we do
riveting.
it for kicks, like,
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I'm like, yeah, like this is every time I dive into this Tavistock stuff, I'm like, okay, I could spend my life just studying this.
Yes.
And yeah, it is fun. It's riveting. It's the study of human nature,
Yeah, you have to
really.
go out of your way to make it, like, incredibly tediously boring. It reminds me of a Monty Python skit where John Cleese is the teacher, and it's like sex ed day, so he gets his wife in there, and they're literally having sex on his desk, and the kids are, like, throwing spitballs and passing notes, and he's like, "Would you kids just pay attention? This is getting
Okay,
out of control." And it's like, of course, if it was that interesting, they would pay
of
attention.
course.
Yeah, it's the reality is that it's always incredibly boring, and I would say, yeah, it doesn't have to
It's
be.
it's like the song "Another Brick in the Wall," right?
Yes. Oh, that's the best.
The
Very
best.
telling.
So Dewey was very instrumental, and so also worth noting, he was the co-author of the Humanist Manifesto.
Ooh,
Yeah,
that is an end of spiritualism.
yes, in 1933, and, it was, so he was he was the co-author of that, and it was also very similar to so what this is to tie back to, Wilhelm Wundt, and, I was saying it doesn't necessarily follow just because his grandfather was in the Illuminati that he necessarily carried out these principles. However, because one of his main disciples was, uh this John Dewey, who exported the education system, and Dewey's principles are very similar to Adam Weishaupt, right? The whole "do what thou wilt." Um, it's very similar to a lot of the principles that are in the original Illuminati manifesto.
That "do what thou wilt" is really undermining our kids' sanity, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and it's a very Nietzschean, like will to power type
But it
of.
doesn't work. It
No,
doesn't work. Everyone can't do that, or you hate each other, and then you're unhappy.
yeah, exactly.
Okay, so
um,
I do have some great books on Dewey and stuff too. Keep talking.
Okay, yeah, Dewey is fascinating. So then, 1886, Freud comes up with his talking cure model, and this is really the foundation for Tavistock. It's one of their primary methods. This is where we get like talk therapy, talk psychology, and it became the signature. Along with the psychotropic drugs. So, this is why I say it really was both. They did the talking cure, but then technology and medicine advances. And of course, they merged the two. Then we get to, all right, let me just make sure. I guess I don't have to go exactly chronologically, but there was just so much. And my notes were all out of
I'll
order.
let you look at your notes while I tell people about this book that I just pulled off my shelf called The
Okay.
Makers of the Modern Mind by
Ooh.
Thomas P. Neal, Neill. And it's for 12 guys, including Dewey, Freud, Darwin, etc. And it's just, actually, Catholic priest recommended this to me, but it was pretty mainstream. Like, it's not super conspiranoid, but it's really, really great. Highly recommend Makers of the Modern Mind by Thomas Neal, Neill. That's how I first learned about Dewey.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm kind of familiar with that, but okay, so I think we'll just jump to the 1914, but in around like 1912, 1913, they're already advising Wilson. But before we get to that, so there was the okay, Tavistock Institute of Human Relations is what it's called now, but there's many precursors and there's many offshoots. So it started out at the Wellington House, and it was known as the British Propaganda Bureau.
I love it.
And this is why I always say it's always done under the guise of defense, because their justification for this was that Germany had a propaganda bureau. They couldn't let Germany get ahead, so they had to create a propaganda bureau for Great Britain. So they create this propaganda bureau at the Wellington House, which was also known as the London headquarters of National Insurance Commission. So I just think that's interesting that all of this seems to be tied to insurance. I feel like, the original insurance was like kind of a cartel to protect the East Indian British companies, the drug companies, right? Essentially, like
Yeah.
that back then, the drugs were different. It was like opium and sugar and caffeine and that sort of thing. But
Wow, sugar.
yeah, sugar. But it
Nice.
was because they were creating a consumeristic model and they knew the sugar was addictive.
Wow.
So it was. I mean, not to say that like all sugar, it's not a drug in that sense, but it was. They knew it had addictive properties, and they were building a consumerist model to foster dependency, and they did know that. Um, so yeah, but I thought that was interesting, and it was Masterman who was the chairman. So he invited 25 authors to come, and over the years, they actually published over 1,600 pamphlets during the war. And it was they had all agreed, and it was kept secret until 1935. They had all agreed that they would write books and pamphlets that would promote the government point of view, and particularly to side with Great Britain getting into World War One. That was the primary purpose of this British Propaganda Bureau, was to garner the acquiescence from the British people and the American people to engage in World War One. Surprisingly, that was not a very popular thing previously. So they had, and then it was during, I think it was I'm trying to find the exact date of the Creel Commission, 1919. Okay, so this is when Bernays and Lippmann were hired, and they were brought into the Creel Commission, which their primary mission was to sway the opinion in favor of war on the side of Britain. And so this is where they weaponized the term isolationist. And I always think about that with
Oh,
Ron Paul.
really?
Yeah. They
Nice.
had, because that was their way of kind of like the way the CIA weaponized the term conspiracy theorist to avert
Mhm.
investigation into the Warren Commission. They did that with Tavistock, did it with the term isolationist. So, it was like a dirty word. If you were an isolationist, then, obviously you didn't want to engage in the war, and that was a bad thing. So that was one of the things that they did. They had brought on, it was in 1919 that Edward Bernays was brought on as the director of Tavistock. And as we said, he's the double nephew of Sigmund Freud. He used a lot of Freudian principles in order to, manipulate public opinion. And or he's credited with being like the father of public relations. I think Willy Munzenberg deserves a lot of that credit as well. He doesn't get really recognized, but definitely I think he was largely responsible, but certainly not to undermine Bernays because he was very
Mhm.
involved. But it was Bernays and Lippmann, who was the journalist who
Walter
codified.
Lippmann, yeah.
Yep,
Mhm.
Walter Lippmann. Yep. So right, and together they codified and applied it in a scientific manner. So they kind of figured out what were the strategic principles that could be executed in order to create these mass marketing campaigns.
So it was you have government propaganda for war, you
Mhm.
have the drug importation, you have the consumption. Are you suggesting that's all a continuum or they're a collaboration? Because I saw the Rockefeller Foundation was involved, but also the British government. And, so is it just a collaboration or did they pass it off one to the other? And maybe, so there's a lot of
Yes,
different factions back then.
both. The Rockefellers, so the Wellington House when it first started was, the founding of the Wellington House was like Lord Rothmere, Lord Rockcliffe, who else was Milner, uh,
Oh,
the Crown, um, who else was it? It was the Rockefellers had a bit of an involvement in the founding, but they weren't. They come in later with their
right.
grants,
Okay.
really.
I understand.
Yeah. Who else was, I'm trying to think. who
So
were
it
the
sounds like the
initial
British
founding.
government was in bed with their own industry. Obviously, I mean, that's pretty clear anyway, but and
Yeah.
they were both on the same page of what they wanted to use this for.
Yes. Oh, yeah. This was definitely, I mean, the crown was largely involved in the
Mhm.
origins. But yeah, there was definitely the Milner, the Lord Rothmere, Lord Rothcliffe, and I'm blanking on who else it was. I'll have to look up in the
Yeah,
original.
no, but I get the idea.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's the typical flyers. Yeah.
And I guess when you put it in terms of the crown rather than say the British government, it's very easy to visualize that, yes, we're talking about individuals, entities, families, whatever you want to say, who have their interest, their economic interest, and an ability to shape the direction of the country.
Yes.
So, and to access the resources that tax dollars or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So, when you think of it that way, as the British, as the crown, as lords, and the companies that they established, it's easier to understand it as not even a continuum, but like the same entities, really.
It's the
It's really
same
just one
entities.
thing.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't even care as much about if it hadn't become not necessarily Tavistock, but just generally like the world power, if it didn't become even detached from the people. So when it was actually the crown and British lords or whatever making a lot of British companies successful on the world stage, I feel like it's possible that would benefit their people. But now I feel like it's an international plot that is conspiring to leave behind all the people of the world. Americans should go backwards. People in the UK should go backwards. Speaking to the Milner Fabian thing we talked about, and how London is just it's not a metropolis; it's a cosmopolis.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, and even from the origins, even when it was at the Wellington House, I mean, they were very instrumental in manipulating the opinions of the American people too. So it was not just the British people, right? Because
Okay, yeah,
yeah, because they had Bernays and Lippmann come and be part of the Creel Commission. They oversaw Wilson and advised him on how to, you know, essentially the propaganda to
yeah.
get people engaged and support the war.
And when I was reading the hidden history of World War One, I forget the big lord who did. I don't know if it was Milner or what. One of those guys said, and he was really high, prominent politician
Mhm,
type, and but privately he said like the people are, we've heard this before. They're just cannon fodder. I don't care. I have contempt for them. We
mhm.
need to like worry what they think about, but only for this reason. And yeah, so the idea that even then there was any alignment of interest just because they were all actually British, that they might benefit the British people. No, I think that was not true. And plus, they were actually literally using them as practically literally as cannon fodder, like with the
Oh, they
cannon,
were.
throwing them trench warfare. I mean, it's almost like nothing could be less humane in a war scenario than trench warfare. Like if you avoid that with chemical weapons, like avoid that at all costs. But they
At
didn't.
all costs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so we get to so that's like through the war. And they were largely, and that was initially what they were founded under the auspices of, was to manipulate the opinions to get people to support, mostly the British and the American, to support the First World War and to engage, because they would have had too much resistance otherwise. So that was the Wellington House, the British Propaganda Bureau. So they started off, I mean, and they were known as the Propaganda Bureau. So I mean, they started off as a propaganda machine. They were a brainwashing machine from the beginning. And then in 1920 is when it became the Tavistock Clinic. So the Tavistock Clinic, which was named after the 11th Duke of Tavistock, the Marquis of Tavistock, who was Hastings Russell. Now, he donates this building to specifically designated for doing the shell shock therapy research on the soldiers. And what's
And that's
interesting
what's
about
credited as the original research for Tavistock. If you look in Wiki, it'll tell you that
yes,
that's where it all started. It also tells you that there's a lot of conspiracy theories swirling around Tavistock, which
I
when it
know.
makes Wikipedia, like you gotta think they've got to address it. But yes, so yes,
Yeah,
so that was the first thing, is that they said they were taking, and of course, like that just opens such a can of worms. That explains JFK to me in a nutshell. Like that, the idea was that people are so susceptible when they're in shock, and they could
yes.
use mass shock to make radical like paradigm shifts in the culture, and that's where it all started, was that.
That's absolutely right, and that was, John
Oh,
Rawlings.
so maybe the trench warfare thing was like, actually, I mean, that might be going too far to think they planned that in advance, but I just said nothing could be worse than trench warfare and chemical warfare. It's like as if you were looking for the worst possible type of war you could have, and they did it to their own people, and then they exploited it. So,
Yeah. Well, and it advances with the technology, right? So,
yeah.
they start off with the a lot of it is the psychological warfare. The psychological warfare is kind of the same through line throughout all stages of war. Of course, I think that's ramped up. It's even worse now. But with each stage of technology, right? Like the gunpowder takes it to another level. Then you have the industrial, then of course then the nuclear. So with each phase, it ramps it up. But
Yes.
the war is still, but when what you're talking about is Reese developed the Tavistock method, and he was the co-founder. He was also known as the co-founder of the World Federation of Mental Health later in 1948, but he was the director of Tavistock. So he was the deputy director of Tavistock, and he became the director in 1932. But he developed the Tavistock method, which is exactly what you're talking about. It's what we think of, this trauma-based mind control. But what he said is it controls stress in what he called a psychologically controlled environment in order to make people give up their firmly entrenched beliefs under peer pressure. That's like that's the primary, and I'll give you a bunch of other quotes from Reese because they kind of just made me sick.
Yeah.
But before we get to that, so yes, it
Yeah,
became
I mean,
the
the consensus building.
right.
Yeah, is
Yeah,
using
exactly. Manipulating, manufacturing
manipulatively.
consent.
Right, right.
Exactly. So but I wanted to tell you about the Duke of Tavistock, right? So he is the it was Herbrand Arthur Russell, who was the 11th Duke of Tavistock. He donates this building for shell shock therapy. So I'm trying to find what was his. Okay, yeah. So his name was Herbrand Arthur Russell. Usually they just say the 11. They don't give the name, so
Yeah,
I had to look
right.
it up. So
But he
Herbrand
was a
also,
Russell. Now
he's
the
a Russell.
Russell is
Yes.
a name in the Illuminati, and like the Yale,
Well, his
Skull and
father,
Bones is called the
yes,
Russell
exactly.
Trust.
1832, William Huntington Russell and Alonzo Taft created Skull and Bones.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to scoop you there.
No, you
I just
knew.
remembered it because I was researching the Boston Marathon bomber who was
Yep,
married to Kathleen Russell, or Catherine
yep.
Russell,
Catherine
whose
Russell.
father was like or grandfather was CIA, Skull and Bones, and their name was Russell. And I was trying to
Russell.
connect them to the Russell Trust. I couldn't actually connect those two dots, but boy, it didn't matter because by then there were worms everywhere.
All gloves are off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so and he was also Order of St. John, the Knight of Grace, Order of Garter, Order of British Empire, and a Fellow of the Royal Society. So, yeah. So I just thought that was interesting. There's
Oh
a
yeah.
direct connection to Skull and Bones and the Illuminati.
Yeah, so
So,
when you say they, I mean, it's not some broad, like you can really narrow it down. And then you see how they like the same names come up over and over again, and there's
yeah,
only 1 or 2 degrees of separation across like the different fields, the different
yeah, the
spheres of human
bloodlines, and it
society.
really
Yeah.
is all connected. And that's why I know this is tedious the way that I do this, but I think it's so important for people to see the direct lineage, who was
Hmm.
connected to who was trained by who. Because when you start to see that, people always say, "Well, how they?" I think you have like two camps. It's either the people who want to blame everything on one person or one entity, or you have the opposite where people are like, "Oh, this is so many people and so many moving parts, and so there's no way they could all be connected." But actually, no, it's kind of a little of both. And when you start to see how all of these people are interconnected and interwoven, I think that then it paints a much clearer picture. So that's why I know it's super tedious the way that I go through all of the different names and how they're connected. But I think that it really does help to understand this. It's not that there is just one entity, and it's not that it's all disjointed. It's that there's a shared worldview, but then there's a lot of organizations that bring people under an umbrella. And that's part of why Tavistock, I think, is so powerful, is because there's so many organizations and entities that are under Tavistock that are connected through Tavistock. So I think that's part of why they have so much power. And it's also why they're able to, for so long, remain kind of in secret.
Oh my gosh, did you see I had tweeted at you yesterday the Tavistock, like, homepage, and it's so bizarre because every picture, it's like, "Meet our staff," and there's, like,
And it's all
a
blurry.
lamp, yes, it's super blurry, or, like, "This is our, head of whatever," and there's, like, a lamp in front of his face, and it's just so it's, like, literally shrouded in secrecy. You can't find one picture I mean, you would never post a blurry picture. It's almost like they want, they're advertising their occultedness.
They do. Well, I don't know if I should jump to this right now, but Reese actually talks about how they should be fifth columnists. I'll just read it now because that's exactly what you're talking about. So Reese says, let me see if I have the quote before that. Okay, so this is a little bit later, but it's in 1940. I'll just read it now because I think it's relevant. But he was at the meeting for the National Council for Mental Hygiene, in the UK, strategic planning for mental health. The National Council of Mental Hygiene was, it's connected to all these mental hygiene organizations, which are essentially just fronts for eugenics, really.
Mhm.
That's really what they were involved in. But he says, we can therefore justifiably stress our particular point of view with regard to the proper development of the human psyche, even though our knowledge may be incomplete. We must aim to make it permeate every educational activity in our national life. How do they aim to do that? They wanted to infiltrate the most pervasive institutions in social culture, the education system and the church. Quote, public life, politics, and industry should all be within our spheres of influence. Do you want to say something first and then I'll go
I
on?
just
Or
wanted to say that don't gloss over the fact that he said we actually don't know for sure if we're right.
yeah,
We don't. It's incomplete. Saul
yeah,
Alinsky used to say
incomplete
that too.
knowledge.
Like, it's more important to take action than to be
Well,
right.
Saul Alinsky was very much modeled after Tavistock
Oh
and
yeah.
after this the principles of John Rawling Rees, and you'll see that here. So he says, if we are to infiltrate the professional and social activities of other people, I think we must imitate the totalitarians and organize some sort of fifth column activity. If better ideas on mental health are to progress and spread, we as the salesmen must lose our identity. Let us all, therefore, very secretly be fifth columnists. And he said
Wow.
that
And
in the Mental Health Journal.
fifth column is to infiltrate and transform society from within rather than just
Yes.
an out and out shooting revolution. It's
The
to make them.
direct, yeah, the literal definition is a group of people who act traitorously and subversively out of a secret sympathy with an enemy of their country. That's,
Oh, interesting. Wow. Okay.
yep. So, and that was what he was advocating.
Aspiring to, yeah, right. Advocating. Yeah.
And
Wow.
yeah, and Alinsky did take a lot of his tactics
Well, he
from,
was definitely, I mean, I hate to use the word communist because it's so propaganda-y, but Saul Alinsky would be a fifth columnist working in favor of the communists for sure.
absolutely. Yeah. So, okay, so this is the, and then, okay, so in 1921, around the same time, Bowlby and Sargent were also conducting the same type of shell shock therapy research. They were kind of like an offshoot at the Maudsley Hospital under the Mapother Institute of Psychiatry, and that's where they did insulin shell shock therapy research.
Wait,
So,
insulin shell shock therapy?
yes, that was where they would give like
Oh,
injections.
insulin?
Yeah,
Oh, wow. That's
which he
dangerous.
knew could be deadly. Yeah,
Yeah,
they
right.
knew.
Wow.
Yeah,
Jeez.
so I think that's worth noting, though. They do all of these kind of experiments where, they know that people could be,
Yeah.
disabled permanently, could die. It's real. Yeah, they just do these
Yeah, that's
experiments.
why it really can't be a science because it's unethical
Yeah, I mean, I
to
guess
do
it could still
human
be a
experiments.
science, but but I would
But how
definitely
can
question
you
it.
science the scientific method. I mean, you can like it or not, but one of the tenets is that you create a hypothesis, you
Mhm.
conduct an experiment, and you observe the outcome. And you can't really do that in psychology and be ethical.
No, but I don't know, does science require that you have an ethical
Oh,
foundation?
no, I'm just saying they can't really make it a science. Well, I guess they can
Oh, I
behind the
think they
scenes, and
yeah,
that's what this book was saying, that in Russia they can because they didn't care,
yeah,
but yes, yes,
that's
sorry, they
right,
could, but they may
and they
not,
weren't in the United States at
it
this
would
time,
it would
so
be frowned upon, let's just say that
yeah,
in
they would
public.
definitely devoid
Yes,
of ethics for sure. So
yes,
Bowlby was friends with Julian Huxley. So we all know Julian Huxley, brother of Aldous Huxley, Brave New World. But Julian Huxley was also a eugenicist, with UNESCO, the UN. He coined the term transhumanism. He was also, we'll later see the connection. So H.G. Wells was very involved in Tavistock. He was one of those, when I was saying earlier that they invited 25 authors and that that who were engaged in these like propaganda reports and books. Um, those Wells was like one of them, and it was like Kipling, a whole bunch of really big names. I'd have to go back and look at all 25 of them,
yeah,
but yeah. So, but Julian Huxley coined transhumanism. Wrote letters to Darwin. He was connected to H.G. Wells. So Thomas Henry Huxley was the grandfather. He was the teacher to Darwin. No, he was known. Sorry, forgive me. So he was a teacher to H.G. Wells, and then H.G. Wells taught the Huxley brothers. Thomas Henry Huxley, the grandfather, was known as Darwin's bulldog. So he was very enamored with Darwin, very a huge proponent and advocate of Darwinism, which of course later becomes social Darwinism, which
yeah,
is
there was in this book I mentioned earlier, Makers of the Modern Mind, the section on Darwin talks about how 2 things, well, that Darwin was hesitant to bring this forward because he knew it would undermine, Christianity. And maybe it was Huxley, I'll have to look at the book again. Somebody was like, "Yeah, yeah, bring it."
bring it. Well, Tavistock was very instrumental in undermining Christianity. And when you start to look at the people who were, again, this is why it's really important to look at the individuals and what their belief system is, what their family lines are, what their connections and training is, because many of them do come from occultic roots. And when you look at even like the Illuminati Manifesto is so similar to the New World Order. It is all about overthrowing all the monarchs, overthrowing all religion, because they wanted to funnel everything in towards a one world. Um, so Tavistock was largely focused on overthrowing Christianity because they wanted to take down the Western civilization, destroy the family, so they could direct people towards essentially what we would now call like a new world order. Although they used the term back then. Wilson was talked about a new world order
And do they
back in
ever
1913.
like actually say so that they will buy more lollipops or so that we can control them forever or so that they are our slaves? I think one of the passages was about like from Aldous Huxley about it
Mhm.
basically being an open air concentration camp that people won't mind because you're going to give them soma or whatever.
Yeah, so that they'll willingly. Let me see if I can remember the exact quote. What did he say? I have that is one of his exact quote.
I have it too.
Uh, from Huxley. Mm,
I think I have it.
yeah, but it was something to that effect.
Here it is.
Okay.
He says that in the next generation or so, a pharmacological method would arise to make people love their servitude, producing a
Yeah.
dictatorship without tears, a kind of painless concentration camp for entire society, so that people will, in fact, have their liberties taken away from them, but they will enjoy it. I got this from Miriam Hanane's,
Okay.
yeah, her Substack, where she gives hat tips you for turning her on to Tavistock. So There you go.
Oh,
Right back
we
at
see
you.
full circle. I
Yes,
love
yes,
it.
yes. So that yeah, so that's what he said. They will love it. They'll be into it. They will have no liberty. They'll be
Yeah,
happy.
they'll choose their servitude happily, and yeah, they'll be
Yes.
drugged on soma.
Yep.
Totally. This is just the general, and then we'll go into the deeper. But okay, So in 1933, Kurt Lewin emigrates to the United States, and he was one of the and he also worked for the OSS, which then became the CIA, of course. He was okay, and Cecile's puppet, Cyril Burt, also worked for Tavistock Clinic. He was trained by William McDougall of the Society for Psychical Research, which was founded in 1882 by the Cecile with the Hermetic Order of Golden Dawn. This is why I say it really does have occult roots. I know people think that that's so like, I hate to say they use the word conspiratorial, but that makes no sense. So like when you actually look the difference of the definition of what conspiratorial means, it makes no sense that they project that word onto it. But really what people think, it sounds very hyperbolic or paranoid. But the truth is, when you start looking into these people, the roots are occultic. They just are. It's not a judgment call. This is just, that's where these roots are. And here you see it. I mean, it's the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. It was an organization of Secret Service propagandists who use an image of the spiritualist, occultic, or skeptic as a cover to pave the way for the New Age church. Their logo was the trident of Neptune, and it was associated with stage illusion, spirituality, and they conducted research on drugs and hypnosis. So McDougall is also a member of the British Psychoanalytic Society, the British Eugenics Society, and the president of Mensa. And it's worth noting,
Oh no way!
Mensa was created for eugenics. That was the purpose
Wow.
of Mensa.
To find people who should be the breeders, or to
To
find the
find
people
people
who
who
should be
should be the
influenced.
readers and who should be
Wow.
exterminated, right? Yeah,
Would
because
they
there's
exterminate the smart people? Because Mensa's for smart people, right?
right, but there are two types of eugenics, right? There's what they call positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics was this idea that certain people should breed and propagate. This is part of why they're so ancestral, right? Because
Yes.
they want to keep it within these bloodlines. And then there was the other idea that certain people should not propagate, and that there should be a depopulation. This is where abortion comes into play. And when the abortion movement initially, they were pretty overt about it initially, that it was a eugenics movement, and it was targeted at people like the blacks, the disabled. It was a large group, lots of various groups that they were targeting, but they were essentially people, the poor, who they didn't feel should propagate. So yeah, but Mensa was, and they don't anymore, but Mensa, up until not that long ago, actually had a eugenics page on the website.
Wow.
It's not like it was secret. Like, I always suspected that, but then I started doing the research, and I was like, because I also thought it was just interesting, all this like IQ testing of kids.
Yes.
So weird.
I
You
figured
know
it was
my
just
story, like that the CIA tried to recruit me when I was 7 years old, and I'm like, why were
why?
they even doing? Yeah, I'm like, why were they even doing testing when I was 7? It's
Because you
like
took a test, like, in 1st grade?
I mean, I took lots of tests much
Yeah,
younger
yeah,
than,
me too, but
right. So the question is always like, how did they find you? How did they? This was weird. I mean, they came into the school. They told us it was the police, which didn't really make a whole lot of sense, but they put on a skit for us. And then with this skit, I was then each student was called into the principal's office, and we were supposed to tell them what we saw. We watched the skit, and then we had to recount, the scene that we saw essentially. And I did, and I gave a lot of detail. The whole thing looked weird to me. Like, we weren't really sitting and watching; they were positioned strangely. And then there were just weird things, like some of the guys had their hats backwards, and it was they I would tell like what color nail polish some of the women were wearing. So I gave a lot of detail, and they called my parents up to tell that they were like, your daughter has an eidetic memory. We would like talk to you about recruiting her. the CIA, and yeah,
I
and
mean, that just makes so much sense. Like, there's this Johns Hopkins Center for Talented Youth where
I
they
was in that.
study. No,
I w- yeah,
oh, are
when I was
you
in
a
eighth grade.
Fed, Courtney? Did they say yes
No,
to the CIA?
no, my
Were you
mom
in
was
Lady Gaga's class?
yeah, right now. But my mom hung up on them. So I didn't go, but I did go to the Johns
Wow.
Hopkins program. It was a summer program and they recruited. It
Yeah,
was a Johns Hopkins gifted program. Yeah,
yeah,
I
and
when I
it's
was
to
moving,
find
I
them.
found the
Yeah.
thing. Yeah.
So Zuckerberg was in that, and I saw when he was on testifying before Congress a couple of years ago. I was like, "Holy shit! I know exactly what that was about." He was a classics major, and he transferred to Exeter as a junior. I'm not going to get into how weird that is, but I was like,
Yeah.
"Really?" And his mom was a psychiatrist, and there's very little information about her. And I looked at that when he was at Congress, and I said, and then he switched to computer science after that, and I said that he got recruited because of his memory. That's why he's got that job. If you listen
Wow.
to him in Congress, it's like he just can remember it all,
Right. He can
and that's
recite.
all there was to it, in my opinion.
That's
And you're making me
crazy.
think that's true.
It probably is. That
Yeah,
makes a lot of
and
sense.
I know they recruit history majors because they're meant to memorize a lot of stuff.
Right. Wow. Well, I definitely don't. So apparently, eidetic memories are only 2% of children. Only children have eidetic memories. You
What
grow
is
out
that?
of it. So eidetic is similar to photographic, but it's
Right.
experiential. So you remember, you have a sensorial recollection. So it's not just like seeing a picture and recalling it. You remember the whole surroundings. So you might have like, the auditory stimuli, the visual, the smells, whatever experience you were having,
Wow.
it's as if you're immersed in it. It's an immersive recall.
Wow. I do
But
not have that.
apparently
Wow.
children outgrow that because it would stunt their emotional and cognitive development. So for kind of functional reasons, children outgrow it, and it's only 2% of children that have it. Now, some of them will go on to retain a, very strong photographic memory or a very strong audiographic memory, but they don't actually have the eidetic.
That's
I don't have either of them
so
anymore, but
that's so fascinating because just okay, so they have that where they find those kids at that age in this way, and
right,
I've suspected numerous other ways that they find stuff like that, not just, like, go out and interview everybody to
right.
see who's gonna hit it, but anybody who does something weird, like Fidel Castro wrote a letter to FDR when he was 12 saying, "I'll do anything you want." And there's that picture is in I think that's in this it might be in this book, but actually it's no, it's in
Oh,
Servando Analysis Psychological Warfare in the New World Order for sure. So there's a photograph
oh,
of it. You can definitely find it. And like James Comey had a weird thing when he was 17 where he absolutely swore that he witnessed against a guy, bore false witness against somebody who later won millions of dollars against the government because he was falsely convicted. And I think they were like, that kid has an unusual gift for lying. And they roped him in. That's what I think about him. There's a few cases like that. And I'm like, I think Julian Assange, I think they find these people really, really young.
they
And,
do. Well, and
and
you sorry, go on, yeah?
yeah, that's all.
And then they groom them, right? Well, I mean, we saw that with like MK Ultra, right? Project Monarch. They were looking for very specific things, and then they would. I mean, I honestly think so much of MK Ultra came out of these Tavistock techniques, and I think they've continued, even though they don't call it MK Ultra anymore. But
Definitely.
supposedly it was shut down in the 70s, but I don't believe that.
Marilyn Monroe, was she MK Ultra? They say
I
she
think
was.
it was.
Yeah.
I think most of them were, honestly. I mean,
They
they're
say even now, like I think there is I don't know if it was Frank Sinatra or somebody basically said, yeah, that I used to go to parties with this chick who was there as an MK Ultra person. It was like, what?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I see it now. So many of the even today, the celebrities, like, they have their breakdown, like, this basically a psychotic break if
Yes.
you watch
Some
it.
of them can't do
They're
it.
30. When they're 30, but that's
Yeah.
when the programming starts to break
Yeah.
down.
So I look at some of these just any superstar. I don't want to like
Yeah,
criticize any specific individuals,
sure.
but I just feel like Michael Jackson, for example, like he
Right.
obviously, like you can't bear that. So when I see super mega stars, like I feel bad for them. Like
Oh,
that the
totally.
burden of that, the weight of that, and to stand up. I used to get stage fright on the radio where you don't actually even see anybody,
Right, right.
and I would
Oh,
just
yeah.
think, wow, could you imagine looking at just tens of thousands of people? Like how
Well, I
your
think
psyche is
it's
not designed for that.
Well, I think it's much worse than that. I don't know that that's what's really so traumatic for them. Most of these people are literally traumatized and programmed. So they're a lot of them come from a lineage. So, like you look at things like Project Monarch, and I think a lot of Hollywood is, using the same kind of principles. Project Monarch, they would take intergenerational trauma, and they would often traumatize within utero, because then the child has a more of a inclination towards the submission because of and they're much more susceptible to the programming. So they would take that. There was a couple of other like prerequisites. They wanted children who had IQs over 120 because they were much more likely to use dissociation as a coping mechanism.
Oh,
So
that's what Mensa's for. Actually, to tell you the truth, my mother had me join Mensa when I was like a teenager. I don't like 13. I don't know why. I mean, it was just that moment. I just took the
sure,
test. I didn't actually do it. I didn't go, but I
right.
was like, what are you doing?
There
And
isn't much to go to. They don't
yeah.
have meetings very often, or yeah,
But,
but
I think she thought I was like it was her baby. I was the youngest of 9, and
sure.
she's like, "She's so smart." So she got me this test, and I remember thinking like, "What is this for? Like, what's the point of this?" And I've always
Right.
wondered, like, what was the point of that?
What
Because
is the
there
point?
wasn't like a club. I wasn't playing chess with other
No.
smart kids. It was nothing to it.
Right.
It was just a way to identify. And we did actually have an engineer, like just a engineering college came to our house once to see if I wanted, to recruit me, but I don't think it was related. But you never know. You never
You
know
never
because if you had a
know.
certain IQ, if that was the point, that would make sense. Like there was nothing there but to test your IQ. That was it.
Mhm.
And I'm sure it wasn't private. Like that information went somewhere.
No, and I look at the time periods too. I mean, now I feel like they're doing very different testing with children, but, I feel like in our generation, that was a big one, and there was a
I
lot
don't
of
They probably don't
yeah,
even really have to do the form they yeah, because they're phasing out the formal testing. And I think
they
probably
are.
they get
Now,
more
I think
from
now what they're doing.
likes. They
Yeah,
get
so
more
they're
from what you're
it's not
liking.
just that, it's SEL. So through the social emotional learning program, there's a lot of tech ed. And so they test, and I think they're doing it to also create, right? Often the data mining, it's cyclical, it's a feedback loop. So they test the kids, and then they beta test. So they test and they use the responses that they get, they collect that information, and then they pivot and they fine tune it. And that is used to program. And I think that's what's happening now with the kids is there because everything is done through the devices, and a lot of their learning is, but it's not just using the device. They're doing a lot of tracking, surveilling,
And
data
you
mining through
could,
it.
as far as like behavioral feedback, you could train people very quickly, very quick. So I was
That's
taking
social media does it.
yeah, I was
Yeah.
taking a test like, "Are you a racist?" And I was like, "What ridiculous test is that?" Clearly, by halfway through, I knew the questions they were trying to get me to say. So
Right.
I just, I answered every question they wanted. They were just like, "Wow, no one's ever been less of a racist than you." I'm like, "Yes, that is true. That is true." But it is also true that I saw, what you were asking. And so they trained me. I thought, I saw what they were asking, but they
Right.
trained me and how to answer those questions. And I think what you're saying is like you can go around, it can just keep cycling.
Yeah.
Mm,
And
very
I
much.
think that's what they do now because they're looking for different things than what they used to be looking for.
Well, they're definitely causing a lot of mental illness.
Yeah.
Like this
And I think
anxiety epidemic is crazy.
crazy. Well, and I think a lot of that is an extension of Tavistock.
Yeah,
So
definitely. I think so. And there are two things I absolutely have to ask you at the
okay,
end of
yeah.
the rundown, but keep going.
Okay. So yeah, so right now I'm just giving a really brief overview kind of timeline until we get to the Tavistock Institute. So then okay, 1943, the Tavistock group was formed. Now, I've seen a lot about this, but it's really hard because if you do a search for Tavistock group, you find in 19 I think 76, and it's like an American, it's not related, but this group was formed and controlled by the Russell, the Cecil, the Forbes, the Parson, the Carnegie Mellon families, and the Spencer families. And it
Spencer,
was
that's Winston Churchill and Diana, Princess
exactly.
Di.
Yes.
Nice.
Tavistock
Sorry,
investigates
scooping.
public reactions and around this time, because this was during the World War II, they also were doing things like testing bombing on civilians. So, yeah,
Churchill did that.
yes.
He's the first one to break that fifth
Well, he
wall,
was
as it
part
were.
of
Yeah,
Tavistock. Yeah.
fourth
Yeah.
wall, whatever. Yeah, interesting. Okay, keep going.
Um, yeah, so and then Reese was made president of the World Federation of Mental Health and under the control of the UN, the WHO. So I just thought that was, interesting to point out is how Tavistock is connected to all of these global NGOs. And then in 1946, the Tavistock Clinic becomes the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations. And that was through a Rockefeller grant. Now, that stuff all gets very interesting because it was through. So, Rockefeller himself was like actually not he wasn't actually a pharma guy. He was actually like a holistic medicine kind of guy.
He's a
But
snake oil salesman.
he was well, yes. So that's what he became. But he became that, right?
Oh.
So there's kind of a chain of events that led him down that path. So they had the monopoly on the petroleum industry at the time, right? So then they commissioned this Flexner report, right? Abraham Flexner writes the Flexner report, and that is where they start to bring the transition into petropharmaceuticals. So they started to defund, because Rockefeller was funding a lot of the medical industry, but now they would defund any schools that were not pharmaceutically trained. So they were no longer funding like naturopathic or pharmaceutical, and they also defunded the certification for that. So like the licensing. So it was to push everything towards these petropharmaceuticals so that they would have a monopoly on that. But this is where it gets very interesting because the advisor for the Rockefeller, the financial advisor, was Max Mason. And he brought on Alan Gregg to be the medical director. Now, Alan Gregg was trained under Flexner. So this took me a long time to find this connection because there's like, why? Alan
Wow.
Gregg was very largely instrumental in pushing the Rockefellers towards psychiatry. And at the time, nobody understood why, because it was like, it wasn't a profitable, lucrative field at the time, and it was not even very well known. It was like, why would we go into psychiatry? It's going to be so expensive, and yeah, there's really just no reason. Yes,
So
the
the
Rockefeller
Rockefeller
Medicine.
Medicine Men by Richard Brown is a find as a book.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Yes.
And so I couldn't figure that out, but then I found that it was Alan Gregg was his mentor was Abraham Flexner. And he was the one who pushed them into psychiatry, and had decided that they were going to be, largely funding psychiatry. So of course that's when you get this switch from the Tavistock Clinic to Tavistock Institute for Human Relations was in they started in 1947. Let me skip ahead a little bit here because let's see. I don't know if I have it in this. Yeah, the Tavistock Clinic then moved. So they actually separated in 1947, and they separated. The clinic moved to the Swiss Cottage in Camden. I don't know. But then the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations was officially formed. And interestingly enough, that's the same time that the OSS becomes the CIA.
Yes.
Right? And we have all these like overlap of people in the OSS that become the CIA, right? Carl Jung was a double agent for the SS and the OSS.
What?
He was agent 488. That was his number. Yeah.
Wow. So he told the Germans that he was in the SS, but he was really working for the OSS?
He was it's hard to know
Or
what
vice versa.
and that I don't know for sure. I just know he
I'm
was a
assuming that it was the first.
well, yeah, that was I mean, that's what they told I mean, that's the
That's what
public
they say.
narrative. I don't know, we don't know
Yeah.
what he told
Yeah, who
them,
knows?
what he
Operation
told us.
Paperclip.
He's a
Yeah, that could
double
have been his cover.
exactly. We don't
Yeah.
know. We
Mhm.
don't but yes, the narrative, the public narrative was that he was working for the
Right.
OSS, but he
Interesting.
was also working with the SS. He was a double agent, and that was his number, 488. Yeah, so okay, so that's the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. I don't know. We can certainly go on from there. That's a huge, but I don't know if you have
Yeah,
you have
that
questions
was
before we get to
great. Let's call that like hour 1.
that's the backstory of how we get to the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations.
Okay, do
Yeah.
you I mean, I don't exhaust you or take a ton of your time, but do you
Yeah.
wanna keep going? That'd be
Yeah,
great.
we can totally keep going. Yeah.
Okay. Uh, let me get some water.
All
Can you
right.
wait a second?
Yes. I can.
Stand by, everyone. Thank you. Okay. All right.
Okay.
So, what's next? So now we're at the Tavistock Institute, and what year is that?
So that eventually it started in 1946. That's when they got the funding, but they separated the clinic and the institute in
Oh, sorry. And is
1947.
that when Rockefeller started funding
It
it?
was his grant that made it possible.
Okay.
Yep. That's when they and I wanted to also add, I thought this was interesting, but one of John Rawling Rees's students at the SHAF, it was Supreme Headquarters of Allied Expeditionary Force during 1943 and World War II. His student was Henry Kissinger.
Get out of town.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So, Adam from Deborah Gets Red Pilled
Yeah.
wants to talk about meta. I think it was called like meta politics or parapolitics or something. He says like how
Okay.
all so his whole goal is to get his mother-in-law to like
Right.
wake up. And
Yes.
it just bums her out. So it's been a long journey. And now he's going
Yes.
to where if you get up high enough and you connect all these dots, like you have to believe that there is some, what you see is not what you get. And I think you should do this for him, or I'll take the notes and do it for you. But this is
Yeah, I'd be
exactly
happy to. We
this
can do it
is oh, that's
together.
great. Yeah.
Whatever
Oh,
you want.
fantastic.
Yeah.
But this parapolitics thing is exactly what all these connections make me think of. Like that when you say they, and I've had people say, "What do you mean by they?" And I'll start telling them. I'll say,
Yeah.
well, if you do, like, if you want to look at the pharma one, it's this. If you want to look at the pure politics, if you want to look at the media one, it's this. If you want to look at academics, it's this. And then these are the people, and this is the organizations that they connect. And they're like, yeah, whatever. It's like, no, it's you can name names. But yeah, Kissinger, of course. Wow. That surprises me, though, because he's got that other thing. I think through Harvard, there was a big, I forget
So
what the,
he was, yeah. So it was a CIA funded program that he helmed at Harvard, where
yeah.
he recruited Klaus Schwab. So
Yes, that was it. Yes,
um,
it was Johnny
he and
Vedmore's
Klaus
talking about that. Yes.
Schwab, he recruited Klaus Schwab along with Herman Kahn and Kenneth Galbraith.
Right.
And they brought
Wow.
him
Yes.
to head the European Management
Yeah.
Symposium in 1970. And then in 1971, that became the World Economic Forum.
Right. Excellent. Okay. Yeah. So but before that, we've got a Kissinger dot at Tavistock.
Yes.
Okay.
He's the student of John Rawling Rees, who was one of the directors of Tavistock. And I mean, Rawling Rees was just a monster. He's the one who basically says that the social scientist should be this secret fifth column entity. This is why they're so shadowy.
And they
That
are,
was
though.
literally his whole method, is that they should be the fifth column. And the primary institutions that he said they should infiltrate, obviously they went way beyond this, but the primary ones they were targeting were the church and education. Yeah, those are their two that Reese was really focused on. But of course, this extends to, media, culture, entertainment. I mean, from the very beginning, it was entertainment because he brought the 25 authors. We didn't have television, in the beginning of Tavistock. They certainly didn't have the big screen movie theaters, but they had books, and they had poets, and they had theatrical performances. And of course, they had journals and media publications. So he brought these 25 authors, very well-known authors, to write the propaganda.
And I believe, and you would know if it's true, that the advent of radio was
Yes,
intended for propaganda purposes.
yes. And so that was Rockefeller. It was Tavistock. It was Rockefeller. It was a Rockefeller Foundation with Princeton. What was it? The Rockefeller Foundation funded Office of Radio Research at Princeton University, and it was established to study the influence of radio on different groups and listeners. That they had Kentrill, it was Hadley Kentrill Alport, who was in charge of the U.S. for the Tavistock Institute. He was like the U.S. Kind of arm of
Mhm.
Tavistock. But it was interesting because Kentrill was roommates with Nelson Rockefeller, who became vice president. Nelson Rockefeller was also the the descendant of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller, who gave us the income tax,
Oh,
right?
and maybe the Fed.
Yeah, well, it
I
was
think he was
connected. So, yeah,
instrumental in the
he
Fed,
was
yeah.
one of the Jekyll Island.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly, exactly.
yeah. Yeah, so it's all
Doc,
connected. It
docs,
really
man.
is. It's so creepy.
So
Uh,
so the clinic arose in 1946, was established in
mhm,
1946, and I think can you yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have another timeline of progression or whatever, but I
yeah.
feel like they really hit their stride in the 60s. But what happened from A to B? Because the 60s is where you have like Marianne Faithfull and
Mhm.
um, Mick Jagger and stuff.
Well, yeah. Okay, so let's see.
But the
I'm trying to
50s, they
think.
must have been incubating these
Well,
ideas.
in the 50s is MK Ultra. So,
Oh.
right?
Oh, Ted
53.
Kaczynski was a victim of that
Mhm.
in I mean, I don't know if they called it that at that time, but yeah.
It was formerly MK Ultra as of 1953, so pretty early in the
Well,
50s.
he was I don't know if you I assume you're aware of this, but that he was involved in a psychological experiment at Harvard. He was the youngest person ever to go to Harvard
Mhm.
and at that time, and they did a psychological experiment where they had him do presentations to upperclassmen.
Mhm.
And they secretly told the upperclassmen to mock him relentlessly and ridicule his ideas just week after week, month after month, and to see how socially isolated he would get. And they did this to a few people. So I guess that
Oh,
worked. But
I
anyway,
guess
so
so.
people think that was technically MK Ultra, although I don't think, like the guy who did it was related, but I don't think that it was actually
Like, you
ever
don't know that it was actually under the umbrella.
right,
It's the
right,
same tactics, though. I mean, it's
right. It's like
essentially
just a Harvard
trauma-based mind.
psychologist. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, it's trauma-based mind control.
Right.
Well, Kentrill, before we jump ahead, because I think the radio, but right, it was Gordon Alport who worked with Kentrill, who co-authored The Psychology of Radio.
Haha,
And
nice.
yes, so
And the
that
War of
was,
the Worlds was so early on
yes,
in radio, like, they really wanted to see how it
and that
worked.
was under Tavistock. Yeah, that was one of their big experiments, and they had like this. I don't I don't want to get this wrong because I was just reading this actually right before I had just seen this. But it was something about like Kentrill had petitioned for funding for this like repeatedly from the Rockefellers to release the story, and they wouldn't. So there's a
The story of
huge
War of the
delay.
Worlds?
Well, of what happened, the results, like of the experiment. Yeah.
Oh,
And they wouldn't.
because
There
they
was
didn't
a
wanna get
huge,
busted, probably.
I guess. I
Wow.
Yeah, I have to look up the details of that. Like, I just saw that really quickly as I was, about to hop on. I was like, "Oh, interesting." But I hadn't known that he was petitioning, and it was like a few years, I think. But yeah, so the radio then, of course, led to television. 1940, the Cantrell also authored The Invasion from Mars, a study in the psychology of panic. And this was the radio broadcast of the War of the World. Okay, so that's what it was. He had, right, that's why there was such a delay. It was a few years because he petitioned to the Rockefellers to fund the release of this. And apparently they were not very forthcoming.
Yeah. Wow.
So
But
that
that does point to how quickly, if they didn't actually establish radio for this purpose, how quickly they wanted to
co-opted
exploit
it.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, exploited it.
Interesting.
I mean, who knows which one came first. I don't know if it was a co-option or if it was intended for, but yeah, so okay, then
And it is all
right.
about technology.
It is.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's just that is the stepping stone. Even in Tragedy and Hope, it says that it's just technology. And I remember thinking, oh yeah, birth control, which is a technology, birth control pills.
Yeah,
What that made that whole 60s inversion possible.
totally. Yeah, totally. And of course it's the same players, right?
Yeah.
Margaret Mead
Oh,
and
and actually
Margaret
one of
Sanger,
the
sorry.
one of the definitions I saw of the Tavistock Clinic was the social technical approach to systems design.
Yes,
So I feel like I was looking for modern articles of them contributing to what used to be called digital cities, is now 15-minute cities.
yes.
And I believe I'm looking for the smoking gun, and I feel like they must be behind and connected to that the labor unrest that is absolutely sweeping the Western world right now for no good reason, I think. And I feel like labor unrest and labor unions are always used to make labor too expensive for the industry and give industry justification to switch to automation.
Yep.
So that's a socio-technical approach to
Two.
society itself. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this was a little bit later, but it was yeah, so they were saying they did the International Standards Organization, which was essentially just an indoctrination program to get everybody globally on board. But they began a new journal titled Evolution Evaluation. This was much later. This is 1995, but it speaks to your point because the institute and the European Commission worked to research the use of smart cards. And smart cards were essentially like a passport for work.
When
This
was this?
1995 is when the research for it
Right.
began. So
Interesting.
the smart cards were used to be identification for potential employment to allow the holder to be easily identified as part of the group. If you had one, employment opportunities would abound. Without one, you would be greatly limited. The smart card study was carried out in the US and parts of Europe. The project involved assessing and validating students' skills with information placed on personal skills smart cards, which would become real passports to employment.
Wow.
I
Well, I mean,
know.
they didn't do it like that, but I'm sure that's what these like employment portals serve that function.
Well,
Where it's just all AI, like, you can't my daughter
yes.
was looking for a job, she's like, "It's just they're just box checking, you don't get to talk." I was like, "Go door to door, go to different coffee shops and whatever." She's like, "No, it's online." I'm like, "Just go. Just
Yeah.
go." You know, they can't tell from the box you checked.
Yeah. So I think though they may not have implemented that, but now because the technology is advanced beyond so far beyond that, what they're doing with the kids is that they're doing all like through the SEL and this tech ed. I think what they're doing, they're essentially kind of mining them to figure out how they can then create a control grid and put you into specific uh, career paths. And I think that's really what they're trying to do, but they're trying to do it in a transhumanist model. So, but people are going to be locked out of opportunities because they're going to steer them so specifically from a really young age. And I think that's what they're mining them to do. And they're also going to lock them out of certain things because they're doing all of this. They're tying, and this is not just in public schools because this is such the fallacy of the whole like, choice. If you go to a
Yeah.
private school and
Yeah,
school
yeah.
choice, it's all such a lie, unfortunately. And it really pains me to say that. I created a board for school choice when I was in 6th grade, so I
Oh,
really
and
thought I was doing
it's
the
an
right thing.
illusion? You think it's an illusion?
Because public-private partnerships. So
Oh, yes,
we're
totally, yeah, yeah.
getting
Like the charter
funding.
schools, yeah.
Exactly. Who's pulling the string? But
Condoleezza Rice advocates for the charter schools to the Council of Foreign Relations. It's a CFR project.
oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
And who was it who was part of the CFR and part of I think it was Reese. I'm gonna have to go back and look, but one of these Tavistock members was like a member of all of those.
Yeah.
But yeah, so uh they're doing it now where they're putting in all these mental health checks, and that's so they're going to be doing personality assessments to the kids in schools, and that will, I mean, one, it
Oh,
can put a label
yes.
on them forever. But
Yes.
it also classifies them into, I think what they're doing is they're exporting all of the testing and the systems the compartmentalization they've done in the military. I think they use the military as a testing
Yes,
ground. And
definitely.
now they're exporting it to the masses, and they're doing it through the schools, but they're gonna create a very, controlled, stratified workforce. I think that I say this because the smart card looked like the initial testing ground for that,
Yep.
but now the technology has so far exceeded that they don't need smart cards.
Interesting. Well,
That's
I
just my
would
theory, but
yeah, I would I do want to know more about that if you come up upon anything
yeah,
else, because I feel like when I did a lot of research into 15-minute cities, they said we've been trying to get we used to call them digital cities. We've been trying to get people to work from home or from little
yeah.
community centers near them digitally for a really long time, but employers absolutely would not budge. Then COVID came along and we were able to do that finally. And
Right.
it seems to me, and then you had like labor shortages, which seemed
Uh-huh.
very bizarre. And now we have like, the hyperinflation is, or high inflation is going to get people to want more wages, maybe fueling this labor unrest. But the labor unrest was starting before inflation really hit. And I have to believe there's a smoking gun there where this is all connected to what you're talking about.
I think it is, and I mean, to me, COVID was like the ultimate mass scale trauma-based mind control. I think that
Yes.
comes out of the shell shock therapy research. It comes out of all of this Tavistock research on how to manipulate the masses, and also through the groups, right? They created what they call segmentation, and so then now you have these different groups that are where they identify within these specific groups, and now they can control you because the purpose of segmentation was to assess where individuals would develop irrational thought processes, and a lot of it was done by immersing them in groups and factions, and they
Okay.
did that through COVID.
It's
So
like you get your own risk pool, like it's
yeah.
insurance, like it's highly, but there was an article, like a limited hangout type article in
Mhm.
Quartz, magazine online, whatever it was, that
Okay.
said the NSA roots of Google, ha ha ha, whatever. And it
Mm.
talks about how it was really what they want to do is create birds of a feather groups. And I don't know if it said it expressly in the article or if I just read between the lines that AI would be used to be where you are the only actual human being in your birds of a feather group. And
Mhm.
once they do that, they can actually manipulate everybody could be a patsy then,
Yeah. Well,
and
this
that
is
the best psych insights you could ever have isn't what like Facebook, it's Google searches. So what you put
right,
about yourself isn't a full picture of you. That's really what you think of you. But the
right,
Google searches is what you think.
right, right. It was because they're feeding you the information, so it's a
Well, and
program.
it's
Yeah.
how your brain is working. So as you go down, like you sit there and you do your research and you're like, oh, what is birds of a feather? Whatever.
Mhm.
And then eventually, wherever you have gone, whatever path, whatever Bandersnatch path you took to get to the end, yes, they get you to the end. They give you that propaganda, but they have gotten a tremendous insight into how your mind works
Oh, yeah.
through the
Yeah.
search history, is what I was getting from that.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally accurate, right? Because they're seeing the associations that you make. What is it that
Yeah, I
you
mean,
pick up on, and where do you follow?
that's powerful, and
Yeah.
actually, what I'm gonna do to follow up on that labor thing is if you look at, I'm sure you've seen it on the World Economic Forum website, and I used to just marvel at the arrogance of these titles, but it'll be shaping the future of, and then
Yep.
it'll say of education, of food. I'm sure there's one of labor,
I'm
and
sure there is.
I'll have to go read that
Oh, and
and see if,
see
yeah.
what they're doing.
Because
Yeah.
that is definitely Tavistock connected because of we went back. I mean, at least the Kissinger dots connect those two, but there's probably many, many dots that connect Tavistock with World Economic Forum.
Oh yeah. No, they're definitely well, there's the World Health Organization, there's the World Health Federation. I mean, there are all those connections, which we have the overlaps of people who are in Tavistock who are also in those. So that's typically how, like, a lot of times I try to find a direct connection to these groups, but it's typically not like the groups are connected, but they try to separate the entities themselves. But what you often find is the same people are in both.
And or they segment it so it isn't so obvious. So for example, Skull and Bones.
Mhm,
One of the Bushes, I think George Bush W,
mhm.
the son, was in it, but I don't think H.W. Bush was actually in Skull and Bones or vice versa. But like they
Yeah,
don't always have every single person. I think they like to not have the same person members of both. Maybe you'll
of
have like a
both.
husband and wife, where the husband is one and the wife is another, like
Yeah,
connections like that, where you can't actually just see it on a piece of paper. Because the CFR membership roster is pretty shocking.
the CFR, it
Membership,
is.
like you can go to CFR and look, and you see people like it'll freak you out. Like Tulsi Gabbard was on there, and
Yep.
um, Heidi Cruz, and there's just a lot of people that I mean, Coleman would say it's not all of them. That's just the sanctum, not the sanctum sanctorum. And that you
Right.
need the innermost is where it's
Yeah.
really
And I
happening.
think that's true because
Yeah,
I've talked to people who are members of
yeah,
actually the CFR actually,
yeah.
and
There's a
they
lot
don't
of
know.
no,
A
and they
lot of
think
them,
you're crazy or
they think you're
stupid.
crazy.
They
They
think
think
you're an ignorant plebe,
you're
pleb.
yeah, yeah, a pleb. Yeah, they
Yeah,
do.
yeah,
It's interesting. I have talked to them
yeah,
and they're just like, "No, that's not what we do." And I'm like,
yeah.
"Okay."
Well, you just don't know that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, they don't
exactly.
know. They have no idea. They think they're doing good, which is fine. Like, and in many
Yeah.
ways, maybe they are. It is logical, whatever. But no, that's why once in a while I like throw out my credentials because they're like mainstream
Right,
statusy
right.
and like I'm not a crazy idiot, whatever.
Right, right.
And I just sound delusional or braggy or whatever. It doesn't work. You can't, there's no bridging that gap. No way.
No,
They're
no.
never gonna get it. But anyway, okay. Continue.
Yeah, so yeah, I think someone was saying, the mass formation psychosis. So that really comes out of that does come out of Tavistock. Also, there's the whole Wilford Bryan was the one who did like he was one of the forerunners of Tavistock as well, and of the clinic, and he did the whole group dynamics. That's like the psychical research was his. I'm gonna have to go back into my notes again. But he was the one who creates like all the research on group dynamics, that's which is kind of like the whole platform of Tavistock. I mean, even when you look at their website now, it's that's what most of it's about. But it was then they took that concept and that paradigm, and it was developed by, was it A. Kenneth Rice. Um, and he was working on all this group therapy and group dynamic research, and then he paired up with Margaret Rioche, who is a psychotherapist, and brought the AK Rice Institute to the United States to continue that work here. So a lot of, not to say that Tavistock doesn't have a large influence, from the UK here. It does in the United States. But they actually set up shop here in the United States under the AK Rice Institute. So I just think that's worth noting. And the research they're doing is pretty interesting too. It's where a lot of, I think all of this, the terms that we get, of course, that when you look at the origins of the uses of these words, I don't know that you can find it, but when you look at the things that they were studying and the the results of these studies, I think that this is where they get things like the DEI, the ESG, all of this type of diversity inclusion. I think it comes out of these group dynamic research. And because a lot of the big corporations are required to take these group dynamic trainings. So these trainings are very similar to like Esalen,
Yeah,
right?
and I would go back to what you said before about these things are like back and forth interactive in that I think they probably determined a long time ago, like they determined that war was such an important cultural change agent. They probably realized, and I think Gustave Le Bon or whatever was writing 100 years ago would write about group dynamics as the way crowds and power, Elias Canetti, that
Mhm.
you have to have the group, you have to have that's how you control the individual. And once they realized unequivocally that that was the best way to get someone to like to get back to what we were talking about in the beginning, to that peer pressure was the best way to get people to abandon their
Their
closely
beliefs.
held beliefs,
Yep.
then they have to make sure everybody's in a group all the time. They have to make sure everybody's institutionalized, which Brzezinski talks about in Crisis of Democracy. He says, well,
Mhm.
in order to get past democracy, we need to make sure that everybody is part of a group where they really don't have any say. Like they need to be part of a labor union, they need to be part of a corporation, they need to be part of a university. They always have to be in an institution that is really rather not democratic, and they have to think that their interests are fully aligned with that group because their identity is
Yep.
becomes a part of that group.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. And then they're so much easier to control because now you're not dealing with the individual. Somebody's
And
now
these guys are way ahead of it because they've been studying group dynamics, they've been studying group control. It's not something that you can with your own senses. It's like, oh, I know how to get to mom. Just tell her she's pretty. Like it's just
right.
it's you don't have any way of seeing it's even probably harder to recognize the manipulation when it's in a group context because you're just looking to the people next to you and you're like, sure, let's go to that concert or whatever.
Right.
And but as an individual, you would be able to see those techniques, but there's just, it's very interesting, very clever.
It's very clever
Clever.
and very maniacal. Um,
Yes.
we'll get to the 60s and the 70s in a bit. I mean, it's very interesting, just like the Grateful Dead. There's right. Eric Trist was one of the primary psychologists for the Tavistock Institute. His son was Alan Trist, who became the producer of the Grateful Dead, who was also working with Bateson, who and R.D. Lang, also members of the Tavistock, who were doing all these LSD experiments. So there's definitely connections there. But I found that the exact quote from Max Mason that I was looking for before. The social sciences will concern themselves with the rationalization of social control, the control of human behavior. He was the advisor for the Rockefellers, and this is what led to the Rockefellers giving the grant to become the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations.
Oh, interesting. So,
They will concern themselves with the rationalization of social control, the control of human behavior.
yeah,
Yeah, so
and
then
human behavior through society. Yeah, they
mm,
do not. The individual is not something they need to worry about especially if they can eradicate it.
right, exactly, which is essentially what their focus is.
Which
So
is
then
why you don't want religion. Like if you a Christianity which has free
oh,
will.
right, so I used to say that, but now I'm careful to specify they don't want Judeo-Christian religion, or I would
Oh,
probably even
so you
argue like
totally
any
you agreed with the Milner Fabian book. The
about
Milner Fabian Conspiracy, the book that you
yeah,
and I talked
yeah,
about. The
in what regard?
punchline to my shock and amazement was they like Islam because
Well, I was gonna
it
say
has a social
I would
control.
say really it's all the Abrahamic faiths because I think the religion still believes in free will, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
so I
don't know.
think it's really they don't want any of the Abrahamic faiths, anything that, believe
Oh,
tied
wow.
to being
Okay.
endowed with I think they use the I think they use Muslims just to pit against each other because
Right,
so much
okay.
of the Islamic religion has been distorted as well. I
Yeah,
mean, I up until recently didn't even realize how similar the Quran is actually to the Bible. There's a lot of similarities. They split off in terms of kind of similar to Judaism, where they have different views on who Christ was, but they
Well, the
still.
behavior, my mother, her neighbors are Muslim, and they really stick to their moral tenets. I mean, they revere her as like an elder. They bring her food. They look
Mhm.
out for her and stuff. And she
Yeah.
has 9 kids or 7 now, but
Right.
but they it's obvious that it's a moral thing. And my father used to be like that too as a Catholic. Like he would go out of his way to
Yeah.
do corporal works of mercy. He would go out of his
Yep.
way to visit the sick and everything like that. Like he would go out of his way to get his brownie points, which I respect and
Sure,
hope to
sure.
emulate. But like I recognize that stuff in the Muslim faith. And I was just saying that what that Fabian conspiracies
Right,
not
no, I
only undermines the culture, but also because there is a little bit more of the authoritarian thing.
yeah,
Because so we have this, we're allowed to rebel against authority,
right,
like secular authority, in favor of our religious authority.
sure.
And the reason that's even an issue is because we have these melting pots where which is like historically probably unusual to have countries that have every different kind of, creed as well as atheism all in the same place, trying to live under the same laws, and laws that are not limited simply to secular interaction. They actually do have a lot of
So this
morality
is
in them.
but this is the one distinction that I have now come to find very important and significant, because I think atheism and atheists have become the boogeyman. I don't actually, and there it's to avert any attention to the esoteric, occultic type of religion or pagan
Ah,
religious beliefs. So that's why I say I don't actually think that it's not religious. It's just not Judeo-Christian.
oh,
Right, because
interesting. Yeah.
that's really, because I really think that their worldview is kind of religious. They believe in, it's just much more akin to
Well,
a,
environmentalism is kind of pagan.
very much so.
Yeah. So,
Well, the environmentalists, but and so there's that. Tavistock has a lot of connections to the Club of Rome as well, and all of these are predicated on a very eugenics or Malthusian principle. But the Club of Rome, I mean, they admitted in their documents that it was propaganda. So they wrote The Limits of Growth in 1972, right? They then in 1992 they wrote, you have it, there you go.
within reach. I know it's an addiction. I really have the
Yeah, yeah, I
libertarian book
understand.
fetish. It's messed up. It's a
Yeah,
fetish.
I get it.
No.
So I tried to buy actually, the,
Books?
actual manual. Yeah, yeah, the Tavistock books on, the social engineering books. I forgot what they're called. I had linked it, I think, to you,
Yeah.
and, they, um, the one from the original one, I could only find one copy, and that one was actually pretty cheap, but it won't get here till the end of October. But the other 2 volumes are over $100 each, and they're actual, like manuscripts from Tavistock.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
yeah, but they're really well. The Tavistock book that Dr. John Coleman wrote is over $5,000, almost $5,000 on
Oh,
Amazon.
snap. Really? Because I don't think I have that one.
So
Dang
I
it.
don't have it, but I printed it out. So
Oh.
uh,
Sometimes I think these expensive books will hold their value. So you could even
yeah, so my friend John Klesick, who wrote this book, he actually has the Tavistock book. I don't, but I printed it out. So
wow.
yeah.
Wow. Nice.
So I told him he's got like a bunch of books that he inherited from Charlotte Isabitten, and I told him if he
Really?
ever needs money, that he would be a pretty rich man if he
Wow.
needed to sell his books, which
Wow.
I'm sure he has no interest in doing. But I just, I was just being funny because I was like, you have all these originals, and I was
Yeah.
like, wow, how do you have those books? Um,
She helped Alex Jones make his bones for sure.
yeah,
Remember that
exactly.
great interview? Boy, they
The
really laid foundation for him to have some
No,
credibility in the truth community.
for sure. Yeah, I don't remember where I was going with that, but
We were talking about group dynamics
yes, I
and
totally
uh
spaced. I went on a whole
well, you
tangent.
Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller was the last thing I wrote down, but that was a while ago.
No, no, this was
The 50s
before
was MK Ultra,
MK Ultra,
and we were headed towards I was looking for Marianne Faithfull and that type of thing, but you were
right.
yep.
This was no, it was something before then when I was talking about the grant that became the Rockefeller. I don't know. I'll remember it. It'll come back. Uh,
Uh, I just have Rawling Reese, just made sure he infiltrated church and education. But
Okay.
birds of a feather.
No, I don't know where I was at with.
All right.
I know. I don't.
All right. Well, let's do 60s.
Okay. Well, I want before we get to 60s, just a couple of really quick things with. Okay, so you had the Kurt Lewin join.
I wonder if that's any relation to Leonard Lewin, who wrote Report from Iron Mountain.
I don't know.
I
It
don't know.
might be.
You never know.
It might be. Yeah, so somebody said you can download the digital copy. Yeah, which that's what I did with Tavistock. I read it like 3 times, but it's in the digital copy. But that's why I printed that out. So, okay, so Kurt Lewin also had the Research Center for Group Dynamics, right, at the University of Michigan. So they started creating all of these different centers also in the United States. Like Cartwright was also a psychologist who she did a lot of like dream studies, and I forgot which university. Oh, the Institute for Social Research in the United States. That was an offshoot of the Frankfurt School. So there's a lot of overlap between the Fabian Socialists and the Frankfurt School through Tavistock.
Is that the Columbia thing? Institute for Social Research? Wasn't that?
That was initially, but then they set up shop in Michigan. They went and they set up a bunch of them. And Cartwright set up the one, I want to say in Michigan. The University of Michigan led to the journal Human Relations, and that started at the University of Michigan. All right, there's a couple of things we're gonna overcoming. So the first volume was Overcoming Resistance to Change and a comparison aims of the Hitler Youth and the Boy Scouts of America. So the Boy Scouts,
my gosh,
the Boy Scouts were doing a lot of research on like submission to authority, and yeah. That's not to say the Boy Scouts are a bad thing, but they definitely were a testing ground.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. They even say that. They say that does not mean the Boy Scouts of America were inherently a bad organization. It just means that part of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations research, they were using aspects of the Boy Scouts as like a petri dish. Okay. So let's see where else. I just want to make sure before we get to the 60s, there were a whole bunch of things that the Office of the OS, CIA before, right, 1947, Operation Paperclip. Okay, so Lewin founded the Research Center for Group Dynamics in 1946. And then the next year, his research, along with the division of the National Education Association, began, and the National Training Laboratories. So this is kind of where that convergence happens with the education system and the indoctrination. A lot of it was done through Tavistock, through John Dewey, through Kurt Lewin, through this Research Center for Group Dynamics, the training groups, right, where group consensus is facilitated by trained individuals. Okay, here.
That's the Delphi technique.
Yeah,
the Delphi technique that from Rand Corporation, which I think was from the 60s.
Rand is one of the like right under Tavistock.
Wow.
So one of the things when you were talking about how wartime was, largely it creates like this destabilization and, in the society, I think that's all very true. And I think there's definitely several agendas that are accomplished, like, depopulation, destabilization, demoralization, of course, economic decline. However, also, what do they do? Remember in the very beginning, I was talking about how they put everything under the guise of defense. When they do that, they have this carte blanche, like Black Ops budget, and they do so much of this human psychological testing. Psychological warfare research is under, and these think tanks, Rand is one of the primary ones, Rand's and the Stanford Research Institute, and both of those are under Tavistock.
Stanford Research Institute, aka Siri.
Yes,
Siri came out of the Stanford Research Institute, and it's like literally named after itself. Oh my gosh, my phone went on because I said her name.
Oh,
literally, the phone started.
Hi,
wiggling.
Siri. I'm sure she's listening.
Oh wow, that's so freaky. Yes. So, okay. Yes, they're all connected. Keep going.
Yes, they are all connected. Then right. Okay, this one I really wanted to address is the sensitivity training is referred to as brainwashing. the national training was it the National Training Laboratory conducted programs relative to Tavistock, such as the NTL and Tavistock Two Traditions of Group Work. Their programming was rethinking and planning for organizational change and the Tavistock Task Working Conference. But I thought the part that was really relevant was the sensitivity training that they literally call brainwashing,
Wow.
because that's what they do, right? And this is what I talk about. I'm in the process. This is the book I'm actually working on. It's called The Compassion Trap, and it's where they exploit the
Interesting.
best aspects of humanity in order to, uh, you know, put people into these different groups and make them protective of their group. And this is how they do it. They do it through this sensitivity, right? You want to be compassionate to these people, and then it creates the otherism. And this is
But that's just for some of the groups because I think it was in Miriam's little blurb there on Substack where she said you take the some groups and you make them protective like that, and then you take other groups and make them feel guilty. So then they also feel
that's
protected.
Well, yeah, and the guilt is part of that protection, right? It's because it's still appealing to this sensitivity, the
Yeah.
compassion, this desire. This is where the virtue signal comes out of, right? This desire to want to appear like you're doing good, although most of the time, all of the things that they tell you to do and the people that they purport to be helping, you're actually hurting them in the process.
Well, not only they're hurting them, but this secular humanism breaks down
Mhm.
because if you need to say that human beings are worthwhile and that's why you're helping them, then as soon as they act like human beings, they're going to lose your support. And that happens a lot with these programs. They go
Yep.
awry and they withdraw support. And that's what's so disruptive. And
So
then you get the guilt cycle comes back.
totally. Yeah, totally. So okay, then after they began publishing the Human Relations Journal. Published some of their titles were Some Principles of Mass Persuasion. This was by Dorwin Cartwright. I just remember Cartwright because of my dream research in high school, and she was involved in a lot of dream analysis. But here they say she helped establish the Institute for Social Research, and it was at University of Michigan. I wasn't sure about that. It was. So here's one of the quotes. She reveals it's conceivable that one persuasive person could, through the use of mass media, bend the world's population to his will.
The
But one
charismatic
person,
personality of
right?
Brzezinski, the charismatic
Exactly.
leader.
The charismatic leaders, exactly. Let me make sure that I'm not mixing things. I'm sure I am, but that's okay. Let's see. Next. I don't know where I'm putting everything. This article describes the modification of cognitive structure in individuals by the means of mass media, and how a person can be
Oh,
induced to to voluntarily do something that he would not otherwise do.
totally. Let's go protest.
Right. 7 years after Cartwright's article appeared, prominent psychiatrist Artie Lang, this is the one who was involved in all the
Yeah.
LSD experiments, was appointed as senior registrar at the Tavistock Clinton. That was in 1956, years after he left the British Army psychiatric unit. So again, it's all through, and so many of these people they even had like a whole wartime commission. Like a lot of these members of Tavistock were involved in either intelligence or psychological operation, but those are all kind of covert. And so through that, then they get recruited out into the public sphere under the guise of, they're helping people.
But they
But
definitely use soldiers for I mean, LSD, that's well documented as I mean,
well,
if you watch those little videos of people on LSD, they're soldiers.
yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think it's because they have so much purview over the soldiers. They pretty much
Yeah,
own them.
you do whatever they tell you to do.
Exactly.
Vaccines, pills, speed, whatever.
Totally. So it was in 1960 that he began experimenting with the LSD, and he became a family therapist in 62 at the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations, and that's where he met Bateson. And Bateson was also involved in LSD experiments and the MK Ultra hallucinogenic project. And he was in the OSS before he became part of the CIA. Yeah, so now we have the Tavistock and Basin and MK Ultra engineer collaborating together. So if that, and then the other connection that was interesting with Bateson was because he and Margaret Mead's daughter, Catherine Bateson, along with Jean Houston, helped Hillary Clinton write the It Takes a Village book.
Yeah,
So,
that one scares me because I think it's a nice idea, actually. The title is a nice idea, you know what I mean? It's nice to think that we're all in it together and that we can provide a good community for our children to grow up and thrive. Just the title.
except the difference is when that community is a product of culture creation that's been contrived versus an organic, tribal or
Yes, where you're
religious.
probably actually related to each other.
Exactly. Yes. So
And
then
it's not a village that they're talking about. There's no global village. That's an
right.
oxymoron. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. That's such an oxymoron, a global village. Exactly. So this is okay, so senior member, this is where Alinsky comes in. Senior member Fred Emery, who he was senior member of Tavistock, who wrote Theories of Social Turbulence. So this is where Alinsky gets his concept of never let a crisis go to waste. It comes out of the social turbulence, which he explained more fully in his other article, which was Futures We're In, and that was later. That was in 1975. But crisis was the foundation of the Emery model. And the theory was that individuals or societies are faced with a series of crises that will attempt to reduce the tension by adaptation and eventually psychological retreat, as if anesthetized, which led to what Emery calls segmentation. So this is where you get that. Yeah. And then segmentation is what we see today, right? Everyone's divided into different segments to keep us from unifying. And this is
And the media is delivered in silos. I call it silos. And I've
it is
seen this before authors say this, and I notice it on Fox and CNN and
yeah,
stuff.
I
They're very
say it all the
careful.
time. I didn't even know people were saying it, but yeah, I agree.
Yeah, they're very careful to make sure that the streams don't cross. Like, you can say things in one avenue, and I think I got that insight. I believe it was Alfred McCoy writing The Politics of Heroin in Southeast Asia. I think it was him saying
Okay.
that that was vetted by the CIA. They would not let him, and understandably so, if even if what you see is what you get, the CIA wouldn't let him write about the
Right.
politics of heroin in Southeast Asia without screening it. And they pulled some things out and they said, "We're not telling you you can never say this. We're just telling you can't say it in this book. This book will be strictly defined by this. And then if you want to do a book on that other subject, that's okay. But there will be no holistic approach to this thing." And I
Oh,
remember thinking, like, that's why you'll see something really shocking on one place, but you will not see it. It won't cross over. That's why I think the
'cause they
powers
don't
that
want
be.
people to connect the dots.
Right. That's why podcasting, as much as I see the value in it in many, many ways of opening eyes, like, I can see it myself compared to radio. Because when I was on the radio, people who never heard what I was saying before were listening and also calling. So then you would hear the perspective of an African immigrant,
Mhm.
and it would counter whatever official narrative was coming at the top of the hour from the news. That's
Yeah.
like, "No, that's not how it is. That's not how I feel. Don't tell me how
Yeah.
I feel." A lot of that. And that's when I noticed that it's okay for me to say stuff on a podcast, but it was not okay on the radio. Not just because of
Ooh,
the reach.
right. Oh, that's very interesting. Well, I did a podcast not too long ago with Jay Dyer. We talked about the classical liberal Overton window. And I thought
Mhm.
this was really fascinating in light of the alternative media, because a lot of people do fall into that. But then when you kind of step outside of that window is when you get really censored and shadow banned and, ostracized and pariahed. So,
Yes.
and to talk about the dialectical paradigm of the Overton window, which is like the CIA libertarianism versus CIA
Yes.
Marxism.
Yes, yes, I was gonna say, like, it's you can't step off that libertarian thing. I actually felt it when I criticized Trump, or if I say anything about Julian Assange. Like, I think people really. I remember once when in the early days when I was like, "Yeah, Edward Snowden is obviously they made a movie. They had ridiculous. The story's ridiculous. It definitely isn't what you see is what you get. And people were like, he's a hero. Like, he's
Right.
fake. He's
Well,
fake.
I
He
see
still has
people
the same. I
saying
predicted he would have the same haircut and glasses his entire public life. And he did, because
people
he
are
lived a
still
regular
saying,
life.
"Well, he should have pardoned them." Like, they're still saying that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Ross Ulbricht now, on the other hand, doesn't get anywhere near the press that Julian Assange, and he should be pardoned. Do you even know who he is?
I don't actually.
He was the one who was he was absolutely railroaded and set up by the Secret Service and whoever else for the Silk Road, the dark webs or whatever. Just it was just I believe it was a marketplace, and they're like, "Oh, you on your marketplace, somebody sold drugs which killed a 13-year-old, and he's serving like consecutive life sentences for murder." And all he did was have this platform, and at one point they got away from him like 1 billion Bitcoin, and two of the investigators on his case went to jail for malfeasance in his case, and that was not permitted as evidence in his own trial. Now
Wow.
that's Ross Ulbricht. So he's the guy Trump should have pardoned.
Right. I
He's the
had
guy
never
who's
even heard of him.
incarcerated. Yes. Yeah, no, and it's really it's a heartbreaking story, heartbreaking.
I have a lot of questions for Trump.
So, but I'm
I
just
think are
saying,
never
so
getting answered.
I felt nervous ever, not nervous, but like I felt like I was not going to be well received if
Right,
I
right.
did that stuff, because it was giving people hope, but beware false hope. At
Yes.
least Ron Paul was
He didn't
expressing
give
a
a whole lot of hope at all.
well, and
But
even he did have it, but I mean, he was expressing a coherent ideology, which included restraint on government that we already have. As if you want to say there's a social contract, that is actually it. It's a highly limited
yeah.
one through the Bill of Rights. There's not, even if he was there to steal votes from Republicans, it doesn't matter. He did a lot of good, and I think they took that
Well, and
zeitgeist
he
and
didn't
they
water anything down. I mean, he like went over so many people's head and he's just like, here's the information. And, I don't really care if you receive it or not, because eventually maybe you will, but which is
right.
great. He's like, here's the truth. I'm just going to drop it on you, which is great. And in hindsight, it was incredibly valuable. I think, what he did for posterity actually, in some ways, it was even more valuable than at the time, because a lot of people just weren't ready to receive it. But now in hindsight, a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, like what he was saying there. Now people are starting to look into what he was actually saying back then.
Right.
I
And
feel like with like Edward Griffin too, I mean, that was back in the
yes.
60s, but yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so I just have to say I have to break at the top of the hour.
Okay.
So then we have to wrap then. I have
Okay. No
work
worries.
coming. But let's so that gives us about 15 minutes, let's say.
Yes.
Can we
Okay.
do like 60s and 70s in 15 minutes?
Yeah, I think maybe. Let's
Or
see.
we can reconvene if there's, I mean, it's just been great. If half of the problem is that I interact with you about these things, but I think that's
Which is
much more
great. That's what makes
interesting.
it a conversation. That makes it way more fun.
That's what makes school more interesting, and it would be more interesting still if we could have people call in. That was another great thing about radio, is
The
that people can
radio.
participate, and that will help you remember stuff. Like, so just the
Oh, of course.
lecture model is a terrible model.
Totally terrible. I mean, I don't see well enough, but I guess the chat is kind of like that. I need to get a big screen so I could actually read it. But I
Yes,
guess
at some
it's like
point,
that.
I didn't, I don't advertise like the live too
Yeah.
much, I just post it. So if we wanted to get, I think I could figure out how to get people to call someday. If you want to have a call-in show, we could do that.
We could totally do it. I think that would be
Usually-
super fun.
It's good to have a call-in show with people who disagree with you,
Sure.
because then it's not an echo chamber. So what you want is like to do it with Jimmy Dore or whatever, and so they bring their
Or
audience.
even people who may agree but have like, something that's kind of outside of the framework, so they might,
Yes.
it might not be, they might align with you on most parts of what you're discussing, but they have questions outside or a specific.
Yeah, or can bring stuff. A lot of these people are
Yeah.
very well read.
Yeah.
Because
they-
we
they
have
know
the
a lot.
libertarian book fetish.
Yeah, exactly. And there's just not enough time to read all the books.
No.
Yeah, so I don't know. I'm trying to think what the best way to do this is, just because it's like I find myself going back and forth in time. Um, so we could do a little skip ahead to the uh what's it
Or say,
called?
or just go however far we can get in 15 minutes, and then we'll do a part 2, and then we can bring some really, really modern stuff like the future of labor.
The future of labor. Tavistock is working a lot on things like AI with
Oh, okay,
teens.
great.
Yeah, they're working on a lot of like conscious and unconscious realities, which I think are kind of conditioning for transhumanism. They're doing interesting things. Of
Okay,
course,
yeah, that goes to their
genderism. So yeah, we can definitely do a what are they doing now? But I think it's really important for people to have the framework and of the history, so they
okay,
understand
so
where they.
let's get as far as we can get
Okay.
today. You don't have to skip stuff. And then
Okay.
next time we'll start there, and then
Okay.
that'll take however long, and then we'll have some time then to talk about the current stuff. So yeah,
Oh,
don't feel like you have to skip ahead. It's been absolutely fascinating. So this will be part
okay.
1, the first half.
Okay. Okay.
Fine.
So, yeah, so then if we can do that, then I wanna go back a little
Perfect.
bit
Yeah, let's do it.
because there's great stuff here. So or scary stuff, however you wanna look at it.
Yeah,
But like
fantastic.
1939, Bertrand Russell organizes the World League for Sexual Reform, and one of the topics was sex change operations and eugenics. And he did that with George Bernard Shaw, and Sigmund Freud. So Bernard Shaw, of course, people remember like Dorian Gray. He was a member of the Fabian Society. And of course, it was also with with Sigmund Freud, Bernie's uncle. And what else was right at that time? But I just thought it was really interesting. They were talking about sex change operations even back then. This is in
I
19.
remember that Swedish person. You
Yes.
remember that first one? That was olden times.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of
And
course, they pick someone fabulous.
right.
You know what I mean? And it's like, "Oh, this is your fantasy. This you could be this gorgeous person."
Right. Yeah, of course. And to put it up as this is the model of what you can
Mhm.
be.
Yes.
I
Miss
I like
Universe. I think Miss
the
Universe was
oh,
was born Mr. Universe,
oh,
I think.
yeah.
It annoys me, I have to say just for the record, it annoys me that the best women are now men. Like the winningest Jeopardy
Well,
female,
so
it was a guy.
where are the feminists? So I
I
think
know.
this is what exactly where I was going to go with this. One of the reasons I really wanted to bring that up is because these people who say that it's not the modern term is slippery slope, but really I don't even like to use that term. I would just say that call it what it is. It's Fabian incrementalism. That's really what this is, right? So they
Towards
started.
transhumanism or what?
Yeah, so yeah,
Okay.
that's what I think. So they started. Tavistock was very invested in women's liberation, and they did it intentionally to destroy the family and overthrow Western civilization, because they thought that it would be an easier way to, control the population. And of course, they had to take women down because they recognized that women were empowered through Christianity, and not in the way that feminists say they're empowered, but really in the role of femininity that was given credence, and it
Yeah,
was
I
it was
mean,
given value.
the doctrinal center of the formation years.
Exactly. So they wanted to overthrow all of that, but I really do think they had a goal of getting to this transgender, transhuman agenda. And people say, well, no, they didn't have that foresight. But you're looking at 1939, where they have this World Federation for Sexual Reform, right? That's World League, sorry, for Sexual Reform. That's not that far after. I mean, it's before the Tavistock Institute was even developed. I mean, not that far after. So I think they really did, because if you look at a lot of these, the world views of these people, if you're taking it from the mystics, the pagans, or the occults, or Luciferian, they worship this hermaphroditic demiurge, right?
That's right.
That's what they worship. So they thought that that was the ideal. That's the role modeling. And so, and then of course, you take that, and then you take these people who, and I mean, even back then, you had people talking about things like transhumanism and technological, technocracy. Essentially, of course, they didn't necessarily know what the details of what the technology would look like, but they knew that they wanted a technological advancement that would be a replacement for these structures that we have now, with like that's why they pit the communists against the capitalists. Ultimately, they're paving the way to merge for a technocracy, which I think they want to, like an AI hyperwork mind. People like Kurzweil, the singularity is near. I don't necessarily think we're in a simulation, but I think that is their goal. They want to point us towards that. But they couldn't just start there. That would be way too radical for the common
Right.
person to
And I
accept.
think
Start with women's liberation.
I think that's where pharma does come in quite a bit, like
Yep.
whether it's SSRIs or sex change stuff or transgender, whatever, or like diabetes, whatever. If you keep people on high level meds like that, they have to be on the grid. They have to be plugged into the technocracy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it
Physically,
also
you have to.
they have to. They're also
Thyroid problems, I feel like when people lose their thyroid, they're fine as long as they always take thyroid medicine.
to have a perpetual business model,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
you also have a dependent
Yeah, they
population,
know what people cannot go off the grid once they're hooked
and you
on
have a tracking model because
arm.
everything in the medical system is digitized now.
But I always said that about Obamacare. Even the selective
Yeah.
service, no, you don't have to get a Social Security card unless you're gonna get a job, even the selective service, unless you're whatever, but Obamacare, you have to register.
You
You
have to
have to
register.
register.
So
Not registering, doing nothing is a crime.
this is a whole tangent, so we won't go there, but
Ah, okay.
Maximus company, Maximus Inc., is connected to Tavistock. They created the whole infrastructure for the database for Obamacare. So that's, yeah, well, definitely was a
I
huge
always
mess.
thought that was about surveillance. Okay. So,
Yes,
yes, do you feel like the transgender thing
partially.
was part of that, what
I think
sounds
it was
like
part of their end goal,
85
their
years ago?
Helios. Yeah, I do think that it was part of the Helios. I think that's kind of where they were
Yeah.
going. They couldn't start there. They start, with the women's lib, and they break up the family, and they start to change your whole thought processes of what it is to be a woman. I know that's,
And toxic masculinity at the
right.
same time. It's the same
Yeah.
thing. It's that
Oh
you
yeah,
have
they
to,
it's
like,
it
attack
goes hand in
power
hand.
position.
Oh, yeah, it goes hand in hand. I mean, men are obviously being attacked as well, but you think about even terms like deadbeat dad. I'm pretty sure Tavistock had a role in creating that propaganda, and that was part of the feminist movement.
Oh, well, I mean, weren't there a lot of guys who abandoned their families, or were they chased away? Like, what do you think is untrue about that? Am I naive?
Well, I think it's the messaging. So I'm not saying there's no such thing as a deadbeat dad. I mean, there's also like
They
a
use it to justify abortion, I'll tell you that.
right, but so I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. What I'm saying is that the messaging and the propaganda behind it. So the same goes for, of course, there are sociopathic whores. Forgive me, but
Yeah,
there
yeah,
are
yeah, yeah.
women who are really manipulative and who
Yeah, yeah.
are totally conniving and self-serving and exploit men and exploit, whatever they can. That exists. But I think that but the messaging around, because you started to see it became so heavy-handed in movies and commercials, like
Yes, yes,
men
yes,
could do
yes,
nothing
yes.
right. They were just these bumbling
Yes, men are
idiots,
bad.
dead beats.
And I've
Yeah.
heard many men complain about how they're treated. They're
I think
kicked
it
out
was
of their own
created.
houses, and they have to pay for them, and they don't get to see their kids, so I think there is definitely a
Well,
flip
and I
side.
also think it was created and manufactured in many ways, because now you take women out of this role of where they were, the modest, nurturing caretakers of the family, and you
Supportive, a
yeah.
supporting role, but a main role, but a supporting role.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't it's a supporting role, but in many
A
ways,
support to the
but
man, like,
integral,
you have
but
your
it's
own
integral.
role, but your role was supportive to that person. That person
Exactly,
got support from you,
and it was
and
also
then
integral because this is a partnership, that one, if everybody plays their role, then both are elevated. I had
right.
a I
Agreed.
Jamie Hanshaw was on an episode I did recently. I think I just aired it today, but no, it was the second one we did. I haven't aired it yet. But anyway, she said how she would watch Survivor and she would watch like, who's most likely to win. And she said that her observation that was that you had like some women who would succeed, some men, but when it was the married couple, they were unstoppable. And I really think that's how it was designed. It sounds like such a silly comment, but it was so profound to me because I think that's absolutely true. When men and women, combine forces and they
I've
celebrate their strengths and weaknesses and
Absolutely. I have seen that in my what's happening right now. So my kids are going to college. They're kind of transitioning to adulthood out of the home. I bought this house. Like
yeah,
we were renting, now we bought this house. And as I've had to buy a lot of furniture because we were renting a furnished house. It was so weird. And anyway, so I've had all these problems in new school for my special son and everything. And every once in a while, I'll say to my husband, like, oh, if you call like this, that'll feel different to them. And then I'm at I don't bug them every minute of every day, but I'm like, I'm kind of at a standstill here. I need you to call and just let them know that you're paying attention. And okay, that's like hardcore sexism. I understand that. However, I also noticed that he has in many ways like a different, because he's so out in the world all the time,
yeah,
need like with the kids, I'm like, oh, this is someone this person has to deal with a teacher or with the school. Like you need to talk to dad about that. Like I don't get like that's not where my experience has been the past 20
yeah,
years. One of them's joining like the radio. I'm like, that I can help you with.
yeah,
But I've absolutely noticed, and I think it was Noble House by James Clavell about like he always had everybody was a team, a male female team, because yin and yang is totally real, and
yeah,
even workplace and cops, everything is like everyone should be a male female team. And I just maybe it sounds sexist, but I'm telling you, in my experience right now, we get so much more done if we
yeah.
recognize who's going to be more effective doing certain things at critical junctures.
And this is the whole lie of feminism that women were sold. They don't need a man. They can do everything a man can do. And when women start behaving in accordance with this lie, what happens to relationships? And how does that emasculate the men? So, do I think it created deadbeat dads? I mean, not all of them, but yeah.
Yeah, but
I
maybe
mean,
they didn't feel like they were valued. That's true. And also the emasculation of the men kind of does the same thing. I mean, there's some,
yeah,
if my husband weren't like, yeah, okay, I'll, whatever, I'll take care of business. You're welcome.
sure,
If he wasn't comfortable in that role, if he didn't have that kind of a feeling of, whatever gravitas, whatever you want to call it,
yeah,
I wouldn't really get as much value from him. And I see my one sister, her husband was a truck driver, and another sister is a single mom. And I just think, wow, that must have been really, really hard when you were down in the trenches and you had absolutely no backup whatsoever. You had no different angle to approach. Nobody who cared about the situation as much as you could actually like at least even be a sounding board for you.
yeah.
It's invaluable. It's invaluable.
Totally. And I think that's why they were so instrumental and so focused on this propaganda because now you've split people up. So now you've created more people who are less set up to fail. Essentially, you're
Yeah,
breaking
they're
up
just
the family and
two-dimensional, and you can't raise kids that way. It's so
no,
hard, and I think I mean, I actually blame, like, TikTok and stuff for the extreme lockdown, for the extreme mental health issues that I
yeah.
think adolescents are experiencing right now,
Although they're
but
also really instrumental in waking a lot of people up right now, I have to say. TikTok is
oh, yeah, TikTok? Because it's
yes.
so bad.
What?
TikTok wakes people up because it's so bad or because it has
No, because, the people get videos on there. I mean,
Oh,
TikTok got
really?
a lot yeah, and it's where a
Oh,
lot of the younger generation a lot of people are waking up from TikTok.
really? Because I
Yeah.
just don't even look at it, like, all I see is
I
just,
know, I didn't either, but I
yeah.
know that people are waking up from TikTok.
Wow.
It's crazy. Yeah,
Alright, great, let's use it against them.
exactly. Yeah. Um, so, I alright, so I
Right,
don't
so we
know
probably
where
should break because,
yeah, maybe
uh
we should break, and
yes,
maybe we'll just go from the start of, we'll just go from where we left off, but
yeah,
I'll
I'll
give a
go
little
back and
bit of
listen
the
to the last few
1940s and
minutes.
then we'll
Yeah,
jump. Yeah.
yeah, how fun. Well, it's so generous of you to I know you're super, super busy and your research is great. And no, really, like, it's such a pleasure for me personally, and thankfully, thousands of people will get to get the benefit of all your research. But I'm really complimented, and like it's a privilege to be the recipient of all this great research and knowledge. And you just bring the enthusiasm. And like when I see all the work that you do in getting people together, and you're working on a book, actually, it's probably a good time to tell people what you are working on and how they can support you, how they can find you. Tell us everything that you want people to know right now. And I'll actually put it on the end of, I'm going to split this in two. I'll
Okay.
put it at the end of both of them.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Well, the best place to find me, so you can go to whatever you prefer, is CourtenayTurner.com. For those who are viewing, you can see how I spell my name's a little bit different. So I say Courtenay. It is pronounced Courtney, but it's Courtenay is how it's spelled. COURTENAY, TURNER.com. And you have all the things you can find there. At the end of every episode, I have like a lot of affiliates. I only, do affiliates with products that I really support. So definitely that's a way that you can help support me. You could just donate, buy me a coffee. That works too. I'm working on getting the next Cause Fest up and going. So definitely we are looking for sponsors. So if you are interested in that, it is super expensive to do. And the last one, I'm super grateful for our sponsor, but we didn't get it till the week of, which made things much less organized than they could have been. Of course, it was also the first one, so it's always a learning curve. But that is Creative Artists Uniting for the Sovereignty of Everyone. That's why we call it the Cause Fest. And it is because we don't want Tavistock artists. We want to support independent creative artists because they're so valuable to the culture. That is part of why they use them for culture creation and socially engineering the masses. So that you can go to rebelsforcause.com. So it's rebels plural, for spelled out FOR, and then cause.com. But you could also go to CourtenayTurner.com and go to Aerial and Speaking Events, and it'll link you right there. We're looking to do that in the middle of November, so possibly the weekend of November 11th or the following weekend of November 18th. But that is still hinging upon sponsors and venues. And I don't know whatever, like, share my stuff. I'm at I think we just released episode 310 or something.
Whoa.
Yeah. So that's in like a little over 2 years.
I see your stuff on Rumble a lot. Do you think that's the best place to go? Is everything there?
Rumble is great. I'm on Rumble. I'm on Rockfin.
Yeah.
I'm really everywhere except for I'm on the audio platforms, really all of them. It's really just YouTube. I don't get to post much because
Right. I know the feeling. Well, I'm so glad you, Courtenay Turner, are on our side, and that your mother hung up on that phone call when you were 7.
Yeah.
It's really great. I just love that. I love really smart, serious professional people on our side fighting the good fight. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for being here. And that's it for now. Thank you all for listening. This is Monica Perez, and this has been a live dive on Deep Dives with Monica Perez.
Yeah.